Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, or maybe even drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. The first thing that struck me about the house was the smell. Fresh paint and the faint scent of pine from the hardwood floors. Sarah walked ahead of me, running her hands along the smooth banister of the staircase, her eyes shining with excitement. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, though I didn't feel as sure as she did. It was a beautiful house, no doubt, but something about the emptiness of it still made me feel like an outsider. It was our first major purchase together. We'd been married for 3 years, and buying a home was supposed to be the next step. We spent weekends talking about what colors we'd paint the walls, and how we'd finally get the dog Sarah always wanted. In the evenings, we'd wander through the empty rooms, imagining furniture in place, and family dinners at the table. "This is where we'll build our life," Sarah kept saying. I nodded, though a part of me still felt like we were just visiting. Moving in was exhausting, with endless boxes, heavy furniture, and countless trips up and down the stairs. Still, there was something deeply satisfying about it. By the end of the first week, the house started to feel like ours. The quiet neighborhood was exactly what we wanted. Kids played outside, birds chirped in the trees, and everything seemed peaceful. It was the kind of place where nothing could go wrong. Every evening, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the rooftops. Our first night in the new bedroom felt almost surreal. I lay there, listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside me, the house settling around us, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creaks from the wooden floors. Those small sounds slowly replaced the emptiness. We had big plans for this place, and with each passing day, it felt more and more like home. It didn't take long for the first signs of trouble to surface. Small things that didn't quite add up. It was just small things at first. A window left open that I was sure I had closed. A door creaking open on its own when no one was around. I brushed it off as the house settling, adjusting to its new inhabitants, but Sarah noticed it too. "Did you leave the back door unlocked?" she asked one morning, her brow furrowed in confusion. I shrugged it off, saying, "I must have forgotten." Still, it was enough to plant a seed of doubt, though neither of us said anything more about it. A few days later, something stranger happened. Sarah was in the shower when I heard her call my name, her voice uneasy. I rushed upstairs, thinking she needed something. "The water suddenly went cold," she said, wrapping a towel around herself. I checked the water heater, but it was fine. "Old house, maybe the pipes are just acting up," I told her, but I wasn't convinced. We had gotten the inspection done before moving in, and everything was supposed to be in working order. Sarah started to get more paranoid after that. She didn't say much, but I could see the tension in her eyes. Every time she walked past a window, she would glance outside like she was expecting to see something. One night, as we were locking up, she turned to me. "Do you ever get the feeling that we're not alone here?" I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a new place. We're still getting used to it." But I knew exactly what she meant. The unease reached its peak a week later. It was around midnight when we heard the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be one of the neighbors walking past, but the steps were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth right by our front door. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and cautiously approached the window. Peeking through the blinds, I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped as soon as I looked. I stayed by the window for a few minutes, listening, but the sound didn't return. "What was it?" Sarah asked from the bed, her voice trembling. "Nothing," I lied, not wanting to scare her. But my heart was racing, and sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I checked outside for any signs that someone had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed grass. It was like the footsteps had never existed at all, and that only made it worse. We tried to settle back into our routine, but things kept happening, little things that made it impossible to ignore the growing tension. Sarah found her keys in the kitchen after swearing she had left them in the living room. I noticed that some of the boxes in the garage were moved around, though neither of us had touched them. Maybe we should get a security system, I suggested one evening. Sarah nodded quickly, too quickly, like she had been thinking the same thing. That weekend, I had a technician come by to install cameras and motion sensors around the property. As he worked, he casually mentioned, "This neighborhood used to have some problems. A lot of break-ins a few years ago, but things have calmed down since." I didn't want to press him for details, but it explained a lot. When Sarah got home, I told her about what the technician said. She was quiet for a moment, then simply said, "That doesn't make me feel better." With the security system in place, we both hoped that things would settle down. The cameras were motion activated, so we would know if anyone came near the house. For the next few days, everything was quiet. No strange noises, no missing items, no feeling of being watched. Sarah even started to relax a little, and for the first time in weeks, we felt like maybe things were finally going back to normal. But that calm didn't last long. One evening, I was reviewing the camera footage, just out of habit, when I noticed something odd. Around 2 a.m. the night before, the camera by the back door had triggered, but the recording only showed the backyard, empty, as usual. I thought it might have been an animal, but then I saw it. A faint shadow at the very edge of the frame, just barely visible. It was enough to send a chill down my spine. Someone had been out there, standing just outside of view. I didn't tell Sarah about the footage. There was no reason to worry her even more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, I stayed up, listening for any sounds. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I crept to the window, bat in hand, and looked out. Again, nothing. The footsteps stopped the moment I got close. It was like whoever, or whatever was out there, knew I was watching. The next morning, I finally told Sarah about the camera footage. She went pale, her hands shaking slightly as she set down her coffee. "We need to call the police," she said firmly, her voice tight with fear. I agreed. That afternoon, an officer came by to take our statement. He walked around the property, checking the cameras and the locks. "Probably just kids messing around," he said, though I could tell he didn't believe it either. "Let us know if it happens again." Days passed without incident. Sarah and I started to think that maybe the police presence had scared off whoever had been lurking around. We began to relax again, though we were still cautious. I checked the camera footage every morning, but nothing unusual came up. It wasn't until the following weekend that things took another strange turn. We had gone out for dinner, and when we returned home, the front door was slightly ajar. My heart dropped into my stomach. I grabbed Sarah's arm, stopping her from going inside. "Stay here," I whispered, moving cautiously toward the door. The house was dark, but I could hear the faint creak of floorboards inside. Someone was there. I stepped inside, bat in hand, and flicked on the lights. The living room was empty, but there was a feeling in the air, something heavy and tense. I called out, "Who's here?" No response, just silence. I searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot, but there was no one there. No sign of forced entry, no missing items, nothing to explain why the door had been left open. When I finally let Sarah inside, she looked around nervously. "Are you sure no one's here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, though I didn't feel sure at all. We locked every door and window that night, and neither of us slept well. The next morning, we decided to go through the camera footage again. I played back the recording from the night before, hoping to catch a glimpse of who had entered our home. To my surprise, The camera hadn't picked up anything unusual, except for one thing. At exactly the time we had left for dinner, the front camera stopped recording. There was no footage from the entire evening, as if someone had deliberately cut the feed. Sarah looked at me, her face pale with fear. "Someone is messing with us," she whispered. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. I couldn't explain how someone had been inside without the cameras catching them, but the evidence was clear. We called the police again, but this time, they seemed less interested. "We'll send someone by to patrol the area," the officer said, but I could tell he didn't think it was a priority. We were on our own. We didn't leave the house much after that. Every sound made us jump. Every flicker of light through the window felt like someone watching. Sarah spent more time at work, saying she needed the distraction, but I knew she didn't want to be home alone. I worked from home most days, but I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Even the security system didn't feel like enough anymore. We were on edge, waiting for something to happen. A week later, it did. It was late, probably past midnight, when we heard the sound of glass breaking. We both sat up in bed, our hearts racing. "Stay here," I whispered to Sarah as I grabbed the bat and crept downstairs. The kitchen window was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. My mind raced. Who could have done this? As I stood there, frozen, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, bat raised, but there was no one there. The police arrived not long after I called. They searched the house, but again, there was no sign of anyone inside. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing but the broken window. "You should consider moving," one of the officers said as he handed me a report to sign. Sarah overheard and gave me a look. Moving, after everything we'd put into this house. The idea of leaving made me feel sick, but I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. That night, after the police left, Sarah and I sat in the darkened living room, the weight of everything pressing down on us. "What if we are wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if it's just someone messing with us, trying to scare us into leaving?" I wanted to believe that. I wanted to think it was just a prank, something harmless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something much darker going on, and we were caught right in the middle of it. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. The tension between Sarah and me grew, as if we were both waiting for the other to admit we had made a mistake by staying. Then, one evening, just as I thought things might be calming down, I heard a knock at the door. It was loud, insistent, like someone pounding with their fist. I opened the door cautiously, and standing there were the two men from before, the ones who claimed they had lived in the house. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice firm, but my hands shaking slightly. The taller one, who had spoken to us before, stepped forward. "We need to come in," he said, not bothering to ask permission. "No, you don't," I replied, blocking the doorway. "This is our house now." He glanced at his friend, then back at me, his expression hardening. "You don't understand. We left something here, something important. We need to find it." His words sent a chill through me. "There's nothing here for you," I said, trying to sound confident. "Now, leave before I call the police." The men exchanged a glance, but they didn't move. "We'll be back," the taller one said. "We won't stop until we get what's ours." With that, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I closed the door, my heart pounding. Sarah had been standing behind me the whole time, and when I turned around, her face was pale. "What do we do now?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. That night, we double-checked the locks, made sure the security cameras were working, and tried to sleep, though neither of us got much rest. I kept thinking about what the men had said. What could they possibly have left behind that was so important? And why hadn't the police been able to find anything when they searched the house? These questions gnawed at me, but I couldn't come up with any explanation that made sense. The next morning, I decided to search the house myself. I spent hours going through every room, opening every closet, checking under the floorboards, behind the walls, anywhere someone could have hidden something, but I found nothing, not even a hint of what the men might have been looking for. When Sarah came home, I told her about my search. She just shook her head, looking defeated. "We can't keep living like this," she said. I knew she was right, but leaving felt like giving up. That night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a loud thud from downstairs. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the bat. Sarah sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "Be careful," she whispered. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was dark, but as I stepped into the hallway, I saw the front door was wide open. I knew I had locked it before bed. Someone had been inside again, and they had left it open. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, whoever had been there was long gone. The officer who came seemed frustrated, as if he thought we were wasting his time. "There's no sign of forced entry," he said, shining his flashlight around the doorframe. "Maybe you just forgot to lock it." I wanted to scream. I knew I hadn't forgotten, but there was no use arguing. The police didn't believe us, and it was clear we were on our own. Sarah barely slept after that. Every sound, every creak, had her sitting up in bed, wide-eyed with fear. I wasn't much better. We started talking about leaving, but the thought of selling the house after everything we had invested in it was overwhelming. We felt trapped, like the house had a hold on us that we couldn't break. The fear had settled in deep, and neither of us could shake it. We were prisoners in our own home, constantly looking over our shoulders. 2 nights later, it happened again. Another knock at the door, this time in the middle of the night. I grabbed the bat, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the sound of the wind and the empty street. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I was losing my mind. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow slipped behind one of the bushes near the driveway. Someone was out there, watching us. I slammed the door and locked it. Sarah came down the stairs, her face pale with fear. "What is it?" she asked. "There's someone out there," I whispered, my voice shaky. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't pack much, just a few essentials. We threw our bags into the car and drove to a hotel on the other side of town. Neither of us spoke the entire drive. The reality of what we were doing, fleeing our own home in the middle of the night, was too much to process. At the hotel, we finally had a moment to breathe. Sarah was still shaken, but she seemed relieved to be away from the house. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about the men, about the shadow I had seen in the yard. There had to be more to the story, something we were missing. I spent hours online, searching for any information about the house, the previous owners, anything that might explain what was happening, but there was nothing. The next morning, I called the real estate agent who had sold us the house. I asked her about the previous owners, if there was anything unusual about them. She hesitated before responding, which immediately put me on edge. "They were an older couple," she said finally. "They moved out rather quickly, but I never heard anything bad about them." It wasn't the answer I had been hoping for, but it was the only lead we had. I decided to track them down. It took a few days, but I managed to find a contact for the previous owners. When I called, an elderly woman answered. I explained who I was, and she listened quietly. After a long pause, she said, "I was wondering when you might call." Her voice was soft, but there was a sadness to it. "You should have been told. That house, it's not just any house. My husband and I didn't leave because we wanted to. My blood ran cold." "What do you mean?" I asked. There was another long pause before she spoke again. "We had to leave," she said quietly. "There are things in that house, things you won't find by looking. We thought we could live with it, but it got worse over time. You'll never feel like it's really yours, because it isn't. It never was." I gripped the phone tightly, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" I asked again, desperate for answers. But she didn't respond. She just hung up. I stood there for a long time, staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what she had said. Things in the house. What did that even mean? Sarah was sitting on the bed, watching me, waiting for me to explain. But I didn't know how to explain it. All I knew was that we couldn't go back. Not yet, at least. "We'll stay at the hotel a few more days," I said, trying to sound calm. Sarah just nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Neither of us knew what to do next. We stayed at the hotel for 3 more nights, trying to avoid talking about the house. Sarah spent most of her time on her laptop, researching places to move, anywhere far from where we were. But something kept pulling me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to understand what was really going on. I couldn't just walk away without knowing why these men kept coming back, why the old owners had warned us. It didn't make sense to leave without answers. The more I thought about it, the more obsessed I became. One night I told Sarah I was going to the house, just to grab a few things. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'll be quick," I assured her, though I wasn't even sure myself. As I pulled up to the house, it looked as if nothing had changed. It was still standing there, quiet and unassuming. But as I unlocked the door, that familiar feeling of dread washed over me. The house was cold, the air still. I walked through the rooms, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I packed a few bags and made my way back to the front door when I heard something, a faint sound, like someone moving upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there for a moment, frozen, listening. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was upstairs. Slowly, I made my way up the stairs, my hands trembling as I gripped the banister. The hallway was empty. I stood outside the bedroom door, listening. There it was, again, the sound of footsteps, this time right behind the door. I held my breath and slowly pushed it open. The room was empty. I let out a shaky breath and turned to leave when I noticed something strange. One of the floorboards near the bed looked different, slightly raised, as if someone had pried it up. My heart raced as I knelt down and carefully pulled at the board. Underneath the floorboard was a small metal box, covered in dust. My hands shook as I lifted it out of the floor. What could this be? I took the box downstairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. Sitting at the kitchen table, I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a stack of old photographs and papers, yellowed with age. The photos showed a family, smiling in front of the house. Our house. But it wasn't the elderly couple we'd heard about. These were much older. I flipped through the photos, my mind racing. Who were these people? There were children, too, standing in front of the house, playing in the backyard. But there was something wrong with the last photo. In it, the family stood on the front porch, but none of them were smiling. They looked stern, almost angry, and behind them, standing in the doorway, was a figure, blurred and dark, like it wasn't supposed to be there. A chill ran down my spine as I quickly put the photo back. The papers in the box were just as strange. Old property records, letters, things that didn't seem to belong to this house. One letter in particular caught my eye. It was from the 1940s, addressed to someone named Harold. It talked about debts, about people coming to collect what was owed. My hands shook as I read it. The pieces of the puzzle started coming together. The men who had been coming to our house, they weren't just random strangers. They were looking for something valuable. I closed the box, my mind racing. I needed to get out of the house. As I grabbed my things and headed for the door, I felt a sudden pressure in the air, like the house was closing in around me. My heart raced as I fumbled with the lock, finally managing to wrench the door open. I practically ran to the car, throwing the bags into the back seat. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the hotel, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. When I got back to the hotel, I showed Sarah the box. She looked through the photos and papers, her expression growing more and more disturbed. "What does this all mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think those men were part of the family," I said slowly, piecing it together. "They must think something valuable was left behind, something connected to these old debts." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "We need to get rid of this, now." We agreed to take the box to the police, but something told me it wouldn't be that simple. The next morning, we went to the station and handed it over. The officer who took our statement looked puzzled. "I'm not sure what we can do with this," he said. "It's just old records. There's no proof these men are connected to any crime." He sighed and handed us a receipt for the evidence, but I could tell they weren't going to follow up on it. It was another dead end. We drove back to the hotel in silence. Sarah was gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "What now?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. I felt drained, like we had hit a wall. But later that night, as I lay in bed, something occurred to me. The men had said they wouldn't stop until they got what was theirs. If the box wasn't what they were looking for, then there had to be something else in the house, something we hadn't found yet. The next morning, I told Sarah I was going back to the house. She was hesitant, but I promised I would be careful. As I pulled up to the driveway, the house looked just as empty and quiet as ever, but I knew better by now. There was something inside that I hadn't found yet, something that was driving these men to keep coming back. I spent hours searching the house, pulling up floorboards, checking the attic, looking for any hidden spaces, but I found nothing. I was about to give up when I remembered something: the basement. We hadn't spent much time down there since we moved in, but it was the one place I hadn't searched thoroughly. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the narrow stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes we hadn't unpacked yet. I moved aside some shelves, and that's when I saw it. A small door in the far corner, almost hidden behind a pile of junk. The door was old, its paint peeling and the wood rotting. My heart pounded as I pulled it open. Behind the door was a small crawl space, barely big enough to fit a person. I shined the flashlight inside and saw something glinting in the far corner. My breath caught in my throat as I crawled in, my knees scraping against the cold concrete. When I reached the back of the space, I saw what had been hidden there: a small, rusted lockbox. My hand shook as I pulled the lockbox out and opened it. Inside was a bundle of old documents, some jewelry, and what looked like cash, old and crumbling. This was what they had been looking for, I realized. The debts mentioned in the letter. This was the collateral, hidden away for decades. But why had the family never come back for it until now? My mind raced with questions as I carried the lockbox upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sat down in the living room, staring at the contents of the lockbox, I realized I was in over my head. I couldn't keep this. It wasn't mine. But what would happen if I handed it over to the police? Would the men come after us again, knowing that we had found what they wanted? I decided to leave the lockbox in the house, where it belonged. If they wanted it, they would have to find it themselves. But we couldn't stay there any longer. We had to leave. When I told Sarah what I had found, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face pale and tired. "We can't stay here," she whispered, and I agreed. We packed up everything we could and left the house that very night. The drive back to the hotel was quiet. Neither of us said a word, but I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on us. We weren't just leaving a house. We were abandoning a dream. The dream of a home, of a place we had hoped to make our own. At the hotel, we started making arrangements to sell the house. It felt like defeat, but we knew we didn't have a choice. The house had a history, one that we couldn't erase or ignore. The men had been right. It wasn't really ours. We were just temporary occupants in a place that belonged to someone else. As we contacted a realtor to begin the process, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wouldn't let us go so easily. 2 days later, we went back to the house to gather the last of our things. It was strange walking through the empty rooms, knowing we would never return. As we packed up the final boxes, I heard Sarah call my name from the hallway. "What is it?" I asked, stepping out of the bedroom. She was standing by the front door, staring at something. When I approached, I saw what had caught her attention. A small envelope tucked under the door, addressed to us. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. There was no return address, just our names written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. I tore it open, my heart pounding. Inside was a single piece of paper, with one sentence scrawled across it. "You found it, but you won't keep it." My blood ran cold. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching us, but the street outside was empty. Sarah's face had gone pale. "We need to leave, now," she said. We hurried out of the house, not bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, my mind raced with possibilities. Who had left the note? How had they known we had found the lockbox? I didn't want to know the answers. All I cared about was getting as far from that house as possible. Sarah was silent beside me, her hands gripping the steering wheel. I could tell she was just as shaken as I was. We were done with that place, once and for all. Over the next few weeks, we finalized the sale of the house. We didn't tell the realtor about the strange events that had unfolded. I figured it wasn't our problem anymore. Let the next owners deal with whatever haunted that place. As we signed the final papers, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that we were finally free of the house, and guilt for leaving it behind for someone else to stumble upon. But I knew there was no other choice. The day after the sale was finalized, we moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it felt safe. We tried to put the house behind us, but it lingered in the back of my mind. A constant reminder of the danger we had narrowly escaped. Sarah seemed to recover quicker than I did. She threw herself into work, focusing on the future. But for me, the memory of that house stuck with me, refusing to fade, like a scar that wouldn't heal. A month passed without incident. We had settled into our new life, and things were starting to feel normal again. But then, one evening, as I was coming home from work, I noticed something strange. There was a car parked across the street from our apartment, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. At first I thought nothing of it, but as I got closer, I noticed the car had no license plate. My stomach dropped. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't tell Sarah about the car, not right away. I didn't want to worry her if it was nothing. But the next evening, the same car was there, parked in the exact same spot. And this time, I was sure someone was inside. I could feel eyes watching me as I walked toward the apartment. My heart raced as I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder. The car didn't move, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I knew then that we hadn't escaped. Not entirely. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the car sitting there, watching, waiting. In the morning, I checked outside, and the car was gone. I tried to convince myself that it had just been a coincidence, that I was letting my paranoia get the best of me. But deep down, I knew better. Something had followed us. Whatever was tied to that house hadn't let go. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing. We couldn't run forever. I decided to confront it. That evening, I waited by the window, watching for the car. Sure enough, it appeared just after sunset, pulling up to the same spot across the street. My heart pounded as I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. As I approached the car, I could feel my pulse in my ears. The window rolled down slowly, revealing the face of the taller man from the house. His eyes met mine, cold and unblinking. "You can't run," he said, his voice low and threatening. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, unsure of what to say. "What do you want?" I finally managed to ask. He didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, as if weighing his words carefully. "You found something that didn't belong to you," he said, his tone even. "Now it's time to give it back." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I don't have it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I left it in the house." The man's expression didn't change. "We'll see," he said. Without another word, the man rolled up the window and drove away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this wasn't over. They would come back, sooner or later, and this time they wouldn't be so patient. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Sarah was in the kitchen, and when she saw the look on my face, she knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaky. "They're not done with us." Sarah's face went pale. "But we just got here," she protested. "We can't keep running." I knew she was right, but the fear had taken hold. "I don't know what else to do," I admitted. "They're going to keep coming until they get what they want." Sarah sat down, her hands trembling. "Maybe we should have never left that house," she said quietly. "Maybe it wasn't just the house. Maybe it's us." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. The house had been the beginning, but whatever had started there had followed us, and it wasn't going to stop. We had become part of its story, whether we liked it or not. I sat down beside her, my mind racing. "So what do we do now?" I asked. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I don't know," she whispered. "I really don't know." That night, we packed our bags once again, unsure of where we would go or how long we could keep running. As we drove away from the apartment, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the car following us. But there was nothing. The road stretched out behind us, dark and empty. For now, we were alone. We drove in silence, the night stretching out before us. The uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on both of us. Sarah stared out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her seat. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. He had said they would come back, and I believed him. No matter where we went, I knew they wouldn't stop until they found what they were looking for, and I wasn't sure we could outrun them. After hours of driving, we finally pulled into a small roadside motel, too exhausted to go any further. The room was cramped and smelled of stale air, but it didn't matter. We weren't here for comfort. We just needed a place to rest, even if only for a few hours. As Sarah lay down on the bed, I sat by the window, watching the empty parking lot. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them leading to any answers. I had no idea how to fix this. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the car pulling up, the men getting out, pounding on our door. But morning came, and the night passed without incident. We packed up and left the motel as quickly as we had arrived. As we drove away, the knot in my stomach tightened. We couldn't keep living like this, constantly running, never knowing when they would find us again. Something had to change. A few days later, we found a place in a small town, far from the city, hoping that the distance would give us some peace. The house was nothing special, but it was enough for now. As we settled in, Sarah and I tried to pretend that we were starting fresh, but the tension lingered between us. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar car passing by, sent a wave of anxiety through us. We were constantly on edge, waiting for the inevitable. Weeks went by, and for a while, it seemed like maybe we had finally escaped. Life started to feel almost normal again, but I knew better than to let my guard down. The memory of that last encounter with the man haunted me. His voice, his cold stare, the threat hanging in the air. It was all still too fresh. Even though we hadn't seen them in a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before they caught up to us again. Next story. It's funny how you get used to the little things. The weight of your apartment key in your pocket, for instance. It's one of those things you never really think about until you lose it. It was a rainy Tuesday when I realized it was gone. I searched every inch of my bag, retraced my steps from the office, but the key had simply disappeared. I had no choice but to get a new one. It wasn't a big deal at first. I went to a nearby locksmith, got a few copies made, and felt that familiar sense of security as the key slipped back into my pocket. Life went on, unremarkably, until I noticed something strange a few days later. There was this guy in my building. Steve, I think his name was. A quiet, awkward man who lived down the hall. We never exchanged more than a polite nod in passing. But after I got the new keys, Steve's demeanor shifted. He seemed too interested. He smiled more, lingered when I was unlocking my door. At first, I dismissed it as harmless. Maybe he was just trying to be friendly. After all, we were neighbors, and I had never really made much effort to know anyone in the building. But there was something about his eyes when he looked at me. They held on to me for too long, like he knew something I didn't. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was late at night. I'd come home after a long shift and headed straight for bed. The apartment was exactly how I left it, except for one small detail. The window in the living room, which I never opened, was unlocked. I convinced myself it was an oversight. The next morning, Steve was in the hallway again. This time, he greeted me by name, which struck me as odd. I couldn't remember ever telling him. "Hey, I saw your light on last night," he said, his voice overly casual. I gave a vague reply, feeling a slight chill, but continued on my way, pretending everything was fine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the window, about Steve. Had I told him my name? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I didn't know what. Then, the unmistakable sound of creaking floorboards echoed from the living room. My heart raced, but when I got up to check, no one was there. I told myself it was the old building settling. That's all. Nothing more. But the feeling of unease lingered. The next day, I went to work, trying to push the paranoia aside. Yet, in the back of my mind, something nagged at me. I couldn't stop thinking about Steve's sudden friendliness and the unlocked window. When I returned home, I noticed something strange again. My kitchen chair was pulled out from the table. I hadn't used the kitchen since the day before. That's when it hit me. The idea I had been avoiding all along. Someone had been inside my apartment. Panic surged through me as I frantically checked the windows and doors. Nothing seemed broken, nothing forced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in here. The apartment felt different, like someone else's presence still lingered in the air. I considered calling the landlord, but what would I even say? There was no proof, just a chair out of place, a window unlocked. The next time I saw Steve, he was waiting near my door. His smile was wider than before. "You left your kitchen light on," he said casually. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I forced a laugh and quickly excused myself, stepping inside and locking the door behind me. I leaned against it, my breath shallow, trying to stay calm. I thought about changing the locks, but it seemed drastic. I hadn't lost my new key, and no one else had a copy. Or so I thought. But the more I considered it, the more certain I became. Steve had a key. Somehow, he had gotten his hands on one of my copies. But how? I couldn't figure it out. I started being more careful, double-checking the windows, leaving lights on when I wasn't home. But the feeling never went away. That creeping sensation that someone was watching me. I even started hearing soft, barely noticeable sounds in the middle of the night, like someone moving through the apartment when they thought I was asleep. One night, I decided to test it. I pretended to go to bed, but stayed awake, listening intently. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard it. The faint creak of a door opening slowly, carefully. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, listening to the soft, almost deliberate footsteps moving toward my bedroom. I wanted to get up, to confront whoever it was, but I was paralyzed by fear. I couldn't move. I stayed there, heart pounding in my chest, until the footsteps retreated and the door closed again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I knew I had to do something. The locksmith. It had to be him. He was the only one who had access to the new key. I went back to his shop the next day, trying to act calm. "Hey," I said casually, "just wondering, did you happen to make an extra copy of my key by mistake?" The man behind the counter gave me a strange look. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "I only made the 2 you asked for." I could tell he was telling the truth. If it wasn't him, then how did Steve get the key? The thought gnawed at me, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I needed to take action, fast, before it was too late. That night, I waited again, this time with a plan. When I heard the door creak open, I stayed as still as possible. I let him get closer, closer, until I knew he was right outside my bedroom. Then, in one swift motion, I switched on the light and flung the door open. Steve was standing there, frozen in place. For a moment, neither of us moved. He didn't say anything. His face, usually so friendly, was blank, emotionless. I couldn't believe it. All this time, he had been sneaking into my apartment, watching me. "Get out," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't argue. He simply turned and walked out, as if nothing had happened. I changed the locks the next morning. After that night, Steve disappeared. No one in the building seemed to know where he had gone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. All I cared about was that my apartment finally felt like mine again. The unease lingered for a while, but eventually, I felt safe. Weeks passed, and life returned to its routine. The tension I had lived with began to dissolve, though a small part of me remained on edge. I never saw Steve again. It was almost as if he had never existed. But one morning, as I left for work, I noticed something that pulled me back into that world of fear. A small note, folded neatly, was tucked under my door. My heart raced as I bent down to pick it up. It was a single sentence, written in neat, almost childlike handwriting. "I'll be seeing you." I froze, staring at the words, feeling a familiar chill crawl up my spine. Steve was still out there, watching. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind spun with possibilities. How could he have gotten in? I had changed the locks. I hadn't seen him for weeks. Did he still have a key, or was this some kind of cruel game he was playing from a distance? I couldn't stand the thought of being watched again. I decided to call the police, but without any solid evidence, what could I really report? A note, strange behavior from a neighbor. It wasn't enough. Frustration boiled inside me as I realized how little control I had over the situation. I crumpled the note and threw it away, determined to not let him intimidate me again. For the next few days, I tried to act normal. I went to work, came home, and tried not to think about the note. But every time I walked into my apartment, I found myself checking the corners, listening for the smallest sound. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the refrigerator felt like a threat. One evening I came home and found something else that sent my heart into overdrive. The framed photo on my living room wall, an old family portrait, was crooked. Just slightly, but enough that I noticed. I hadn't touched it in months. Panic gripped me again. He had been inside, recently, but there were no signs of forced entry. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it could have been knocked off balance by a draft, or maybe I had bumped into it. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had moved it. The next day, I bought a security camera. It was the only thing I could think of to give me peace of mind, to catch him. Installing the camera made me feel better, at least temporarily. It wasn't visible, tucked away in a corner, overlooking the living room. I told myself that if Steve came back, I'd have proof, but the waiting gnawed at me. I became obsessed with checking the footage, constantly reviewing hours of empty rooms, hoping I wouldn't see anything. For days, nothing happened. The camera showed nothing out of the ordinary. I began to relax, convincing myself that maybe Steve had finally given up, or moved away. But then, one night, I caught something. As I scanned through the footage, I saw it. The door to my apartment creaking open, slowly, quietly. My breath caught in my throat as I watched. A figure slipped inside. It was blurry, but I could tell it was Steve. He moved through the living room, glancing around like he belonged there. He didn't touch anything this time. He just stood there for a moment, then left, locking the door behind him. My blood turned to ice. I called the police again, this time with the footage as evidence. They came to my apartment, watched the video, and agreed to investigate. But the sense of violation had already settled deep into my bones. Even if they found him, even if they arrested him, would I ever really feel safe again? My home had become a prison. The police searched the building, questioned neighbors, but Steve was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They promised to keep an eye on things, but their reassurances felt hollow. How could I relax, knowing that Steve had been in my home again, that he might still be lurking somewhere nearby? Days passed, and I grew more paranoid. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with images of Steve standing over me, watching. I started carrying a knife with me around the apartment, even though I knew it wouldn't change anything. Fear had taken root in my life. Then, one evening, I received a call. It was from the police. "We found Steve," the officer said. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it didn't last. The officer continued. "He was found in his apartment, dead. Looks like a heart attack. The building manager found him this morning." I didn't know how to feel. Steve was gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Steve was gone. I didn't have to worry about him creeping into my apartment anymore. The police assured me that they found no sign of foul play, no indication that anyone else had been involved. It was over, or at least, that's what I told myself. But something about it didn't sit right. A man like Steve, who had been so careful, so calculated, suddenly dying of natural causes. It seemed too convenient. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Still, I tried to move on. I had to. The alternative was living in constant fear, and I couldn't handle that anymore. I went back to my routine, though the weight of the past few months still lingered. Work, home, sleep. It all felt mechanical, like I was just going through the motions. My apartment felt different now, too. Quieter. The unease hadn't completely disappeared, but I could breathe again. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. One evening, I decided to go through some old boxes I hadn't touched in years. As I dug through them, I found something strange at the bottom. A small, black key. It was unmarked, unfamiliar, and I had no memory of ever owning it. My heart raced as I stared at it. Where had this key come from, and what did it unlock? I sat there, holding the key, feeling a cold dread creep back into my chest. Had Steve left it there? Had it always been in my apartment, hidden away, waiting to be found? I didn't want to believe it, but the question haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to everything that had happened. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept circling back to the key. What if it unlocked something in my apartment? Or worse, what if it unlocked something in Steve's? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I decided to go to Steve's old apartment. The building manager had said it was still empty. Maybe I'd find answers. I stood outside Steve's door, the key heavy in my hand. My heart pounded as I slipped it into the lock, half expecting it not to fit. But it did. The door clicked open, revealing a dimly lit, musty apartment. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and dust. The room was exactly how Steve had left it. I walked through the apartment, searching for any clue, anything that might explain the key. But everything seemed ordinary until I reached the bedroom. There, sitting on the dresser, was a small box. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing something that made my stomach churn. Inside was a collection of photographs of me, taken inside my apartment. The photographs were chilling. There I was, sitting on my couch, reading a book, cooking dinner, all taken from angles that suggested they were from inside my apartment. I felt sick. Steve hadn't just been watching me. He had been documenting my every move. The sense of violation that I thought was over had only just deepened. I flipped through the stack of photographs, my hands shaking. Some were taken in the daytime, others at night. Some captured moments I had no memory of, like sleeping or simply staring out the window. Steve had been inside my home for far longer than I had ever imagined. I felt my stomach twist, my pulse racing. The worst part was that Steve must have taken these photos over months, maybe even longer. I had always thought I was alone, but I never was. I couldn't even begin to process it. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I dropped the photos back into the box, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. I left Steve's apartment as quickly as I could, locking the door behind me. The key, that strange black key, weighed heavily in my pocket. What other secrets did Steve have? I felt like I had barely scratched the surface of the twisted life he had led. But one thing was clear. Steve had been obsessed with me. Back in my apartment, I couldn't think straight. I paced the living room, my mind racing. How had I let this happen? How had I lived with a man like Steve just down the hall, never knowing he had been inside my home, photographing me? Every creak, every shadow, felt like Steve's presence still lingered, even though he was gone. I called the police once more, explaining everything I had found. They came to take the photographs, but their expressions told me what I already knew. They couldn't do anything now. Steve was dead. The case was closed. I was left with the remnants of his obsession, but no justice, no closure. It felt like a cruel joke. The officer gave me a look of pity as he handed back the black key. "Keep this. We don't need it anymore," he said, his tone soft but indifferent. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but there were none. Steve was gone, and with him, any explanation. I was left in a web of fear I couldn't escape. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, every movement in the darkness, a reminder that I had been watched for so long. I found myself staring at the door, waiting for something, though I didn't know what. The black key sat on my nightstand, a silent, ominous reminder that I was never really alone. Days turned into weeks, and while the immediate terror faded, the paranoia never fully left. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was watching me. It wasn't just Steve. There was something else, some other unseen presence that now haunted my every step. The fear had burrowed into my mind, refusing to let go. I considered moving, leaving the building altogether, but it wasn't that simple. The idea of starting over somewhere new felt like running away, and would it really matter? What if the fear followed me? What if I was never truly safe? These thoughts tormented me, gnawing at my sanity as I tried to continue my life. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There was another note under my door. This one was different from the last. It was shorter, just one word. Tomorrow. My heart pounded in my chest. Steve was dead. I reminded myself, over and over. But someone was still out there, watching. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the note. Tomorrow. What did that mean? Was it a threat? A warning? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I picked up the note, trembling, and looked around the hallway. It was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close, too close. I locked the door and stayed home that day. I couldn't bring myself to leave, not after finding the note. Tomorrow was coming, and I had no idea what it meant. The hours ticked by painfully slowly, each second dragging like an eternity. I kept glancing at the windows, the doors, wondering if someone was going to show up. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about Steve, about the photographs, about whoever had left that note. Tomorrow was coming. But what was waiting for me when it arrived? My thoughts spiraled, and I realized with growing dread that I might never get any answers. The next morning, I woke to a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat as I scrambled out of bed. I checked the peephole, expecting I didn't know what, but it was just the building manager, standing there with a clipboard. I hesitated, then slowly opened the door, still feeling like something was horribly wrong. "Morning," he said, glancing at me with a distracted smile. "I just wanted to remind you that we're having some maintenance work done today. The power might go out for a few hours." My relief was immediate, but short-lived. The note had said tomorrow. Was this the warning? Was something going to happen while the power was out? I thanked the manager and closed the door, my mind racing once again. Maintenance, a power outage. Was it all connected, or was I just being paranoid? I had no way of knowing. All I could do was wait. As the hours dragged on, the sense of impending doom grew stronger, gnawing at me from the inside out. The power went out that afternoon, just as the manager had said. I sat in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The silence was suffocating. I felt trapped, alone, surrounded by shadows that seemed to press in on me from every angle. The waiting was unbearable. Hours passed, and still nothing happened. I started to feel foolish, like I had let my paranoia get the better of me. But just as I began to relax, there was a knock at the door. My blood turned to ice. I froze, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I peeked through the peephole. A figure stood on the other side, their face obscured in the dim light of the hallway. I didn't recognize them. My hands trembled as I stood there, frozen with fear. I didn't want to open the door, but I knew I had to. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, silent, watching. My heart raced as I realized something. They were holding something in their hand. It was a small, black key. The same key I had found weeks ago. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Whoever that person was, they had the key. The key to my apartment. My mind reeled. Steve was dead. How could someone else have the key? I pressed my back against the door, struggling to breathe, as the person knocked again. This time, more forcefully. They weren't going away. Panic surged through me, and I had no idea what to do. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I ran to the bedroom and grabbed my phone, dialing the police with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely hear it over the pounding at the door. "Someone is trying to get into my apartment," I whispered, my voice shaking. The operator asked for my address, and I gave it quickly, trying to stay calm. "Officers are on their way," she said. But how long would they take? The person outside continued knocking, relentlessly. I could hear them jiggling the doorknob now, testing it. I backed away from the door, my pulse thundering in my ears, waiting for the police. The knocking stopped suddenly. My heart froze as silence filled the apartment. For a moment, I thought they had left. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, like metal on metal. They were trying to use the key. I stared at the door, paralyzed by fear. The lock clicked softly, and the door began to open, inch by inch. I couldn't breathe. My body moved on instinct as I rushed to grab a heavy lamp from the side table. I stood behind the door, gripping it tightly, waiting for whoever was on the other side to step in. The door opened wider, and I saw a hand slip inside, holding the key. Whoever it was, they were coming in. The door swung open completely, revealing a man. He was tall, wearing a black coat, his face obscured by a baseball cap. He took one step inside, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't see me, not yet. My heart raced as I held my breath, the lamp raised high, ready to strike. He stepped further into the apartment. I couldn't wait any longer. With all the strength I could muster, I brought the lamp down, aiming for his head. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man crumpled to the floor. I stood there, panting, the lamp still in my hands, as his body lay motionless at my feet. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in gasps. The sound of sirens filled the distance, growing louder by the second. I dropped the lamp, backing away from the man, terrified of what I had done. Had I killed him? My mind raced as I stood there, staring at his still form. I didn't want to get any closer, didn't want to check. All I could do was wait. The police arrived minutes later, their voices muffled by the pounding in my ears. They burst into the apartment, guns drawn, shouting for me to stay where I was. I pointed at the man on the floor, my voice barely audible as I tried to explain. He had a key. He tried to get in. The officers approached the body cautiously. One of the officers knelt beside the man, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," he said, glancing up at me. Relief and terror washed over me all at once. Alive. That meant I hadn't killed him. But who was he? Why did he have the key? The officers began questioning me, but I barely heard them. I couldn't focus. As they cuffed the man and led him out of the apartment, I caught a glimpse of his face. He wasn't anyone I recognized, just a stranger. A stranger who had my key, who had tried to enter my home. My mind swirled with questions, but I had no answers. The only thing I knew was that this nightmare wasn't over. The police took my statement, but they didn't seem to have any more information than I did. The man had no ID on him, nothing to indicate who he was or why he had the key. They promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought it was over, but I knew better. I felt it. The officers left after a while, leaving me alone in the apartment. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I looked at the door, at the lock that had been so easily breached. I knew I should feel safe now, but I didn't. Something was still wrong. I could sense it, like a shadow lurking nearby. I tried to sleep that night, but every creak and groan of the old building kept me on edge. My thoughts kept circling back to the man. Why did he have the key? How long had he been watching me? Was he connected to Steve? Or was this something else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at me, refusing to let me rest. As dawn broke, I finally gave up on sleep. I sat by the window, watching the sun slowly rise over the city. But the usual comfort I found in the morning light wasn't there. I knew the police would investigate, but I also knew they might never find the answers I needed. This ordeal had left a mark on me, one that wouldn't fade easily. The days passed slowly, and while the immediate threat had been removed, the fear lingered. I changed the locks again, installed new security measures, but it didn't matter. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still watching. The paranoia had taken root deep inside me. I wasn't sure I would ever feel safe in my own home again. Next story. I've always been a night driver. The calm, empty roads have a way of clearing my head after a long day. It's the kind of routine you fall into without thinking. The hum of the tires, the occasional flicker of a street lamp, there's something almost meditative about it. That night, I was on Route 27, heading back home after visiting a friend. I wasn't in a rush, just enjoying the stillness of the highway. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I noticed the car ahead. It was swerving slightly, like the driver was distracted or tired. I backed off, giving it space. The road was mostly straight, but there was a sharp turn up ahead, one I knew well. I'd seen too many people underestimate it. The car ahead seemed to be going too fast for that curve, and I felt a sudden wave of anxiety wash over me. Then it happened. The car veered off to the right, wheels screeching as it lost control. I hit the brakes, my eyes locked on the scene ahead. The vehicle flipped over the guardrail, tumbling down the embankment. I was frozen in my seat, heart pounding, but I quickly grabbed my phone to call 911. "There's been an accident on Route 27, I said, my voice shaking. I pulled over, got out, and ran toward the embankment. When I got to the guardrail, the headlights were still visible down the hill, flickering through the trees. The car had landed on its roof. I could see the steam rising from the engine. My heart was racing as I hurried down the slope, struggling to keep my footing in the loose dirt. I had no idea how badly the driver might be injured, but I knew I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. As I got closer, something felt wrong. There was no sound, no movement from the car, no groaning metal or gasping for breath, just silence. I reached the wreck, my hand shaking as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were shattered, and through the broken glass, I saw nothing. No driver, no blood, no sign that anyone had been inside the vehicle at all. My brain couldn't process it. This was impossible. I backed away, confused, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The headlights flickered one last time before going dark. Panic started to set in. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was the dispatcher, asking if I could see the driver. I hesitated, then stammered, I don't think anyone's here." It sounded absurd, even as I said it, but it was the truth. The car was empty, completely empty. A few minutes later, I saw the flashing lights of the police cruiser coming down the road. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a strange sense of dread. What was I going to tell them? I stood at the top of the embankment, waving them down. 2 officers got out, their faces serious, but I could see their confusion when they spotted me standing alone. The officers asked me to show them where the car had gone off the road. I led them to the spot, my hands still trembling. I pointed down the embankment. "It's down there," I said. They followed me down the slope, shining their flashlights ahead. But when we reached the bottom, the car was gone. I stood there, dumbfounded, as the officers exchanged glances. I was sure I had seen it. I had seen the wreck, the lights, the steam. Now, there was nothing but dirt and trees. One of the officers asked me if I was sure about what I saw. "Of course I'm sure," I said, my voice rising. "It was right here. The car flipped, and it went over the guardrail." I called 911 as soon as it happened. They didn't seem convinced, but one of them radioed for backup and started searching the area. I stood there, my heart still pounding, staring at the empty space where the car should have been. I retraced my steps, feeling like I was losing my mind. I walked up and down the slope, looking for any sign of the crash. Tire marks, broken glass, anything. But there was nothing. The other officer had stayed behind, watching me with a puzzled expression. I could tell he didn't believe me. "Look, I'm not crazy," I said, my voice quieter now. "I saw it, I swear." Another police car arrived. and they began questioning me all over again. They checked my ID, asked if I'd been drinking, if I was tired. I wasn't. I knew what I saw. I tried explaining it over and over, but the more I talked, the more ridiculous it sounded. Maybe it was a hallucination, one of them suggested. But how could I have hallucinated something so detailed? I started to feel sick. I just wanted to leave. Finally, they let me go. They told me they'd look into it, but I could see it in their faces. They thought I was wasting their time. I got back into my car, still shaken. As I drove off, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the car reappear on the road behind me. But the road stayed empty. The entire drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How could something like that just vanish? When I got home, I sat in my driveway for a long time, staring at the dashboard. My mind kept replaying the accident, trying to make sense of it. I knew what I saw. There was no way I could have imagined it. But how could the car just disappear? I kept thinking about the driver. What had happened to them? Had they gotten out and run? But why would they leave the car behind? Nothing made sense. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the car flipping over the guardrail again and again. By morning, I decided I needed to do something. I drove back to the scene of the accident. It was broad daylight now, and everything looked different. I parked in the same spot, my heart racing as I walked back to the guardrail. But when I looked down the embankment, the ground was untouched. No skid marks, no broken branches, nothing. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. I had seen the accident. I had called the police. Yet there was no trace of it, as if it had never happened. I finally turned away, defeated. As I got back in my car, something caught my eye. A glint of metal in the ditch a few feet away. I walked over and found a small piece of twisted metal, barely noticeable. It looked like it had come from a car. My heart skipped a beat. The small piece of metal felt cold in my hand, but it was real. I hadn't imagined it. It wasn't much, but it was proof. I placed it carefully in my jacket pocket and headed back to my car. My mind was racing with questions. Why had the car vanished? What had happened to the driver? I couldn't let it go. I had to figure out what was going on, even if no one believed me. I spent the next few days obsessed. I drove back to the scene more times than I can count, hoping to find something, anything that would explain what happened. But every time I went, it was the same. No sign of the crash. No evidence the car had ever been there, except for that small piece of metal. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I had imagined it, but how could I explain the metal? One evening, I decided to search online for any reports of accidents on Route 27. I spent hours combing through news articles, police reports, anything I could find. But there was nothing. No accidents had been reported in that area for weeks. Frustration started to bubble up inside me. It was like the crash had been erased from existence. But that wasn't possible. I knew what I had seen. Just when I was about to give up, I found something. It was an old newspaper article, buried deep in the search results. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance on Route 27. My pulse quickened as I clicked on it. The article was from 10 years ago. It described an accident eerily similar to what I had witnessed. A car had gone off the road near the same sharp curve, but when authorities arrived, the vehicle had vanished without a trace. My heart raced as I read through the article. It detailed how the driver of the car, a man in his 30s, had never been found. There were no leads, no evidence of foul play. It was like the road had swallowed him whole. The article speculated about everything from hit-and-runs to kidnappings, but nothing ever came of the investigation. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What if the same thing had happened again? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something no one had figured out. I started visiting the library, pulling up more old articles, looking for any pattern or clue that could explain the disappearances. It wasn't long before I discovered there had been several incidents like this over the past few decades. Cars going off the road, only to vanish by the time help arrived. Each one happened near that same curve on Route 27. I tried to make sense of it. Was it some kind of bizarre optical illusion, a trick of the terrain? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, but no answers. I even tried reaching out to the police again, but they dismissed me, saying there was no record of any accidents on that stretch of road. I could hear the disbelief in their voices. They thought I was making it all up. It wasn't long before I started having nightmares. In them, I was driving down Route 27, and the road never ended. I would see headlights in the distance, swerving just like that night, but every time I got closer, the car would vanish, leaving me alone in the dark. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The nightmares were relentless, night after night, as if the road itself was haunting me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back, not just to visit, but to really investigate. I brought a flashlight, a camera, and some basic tools. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find something. It was late when I arrived, the air cold and still. I parked at the same spot, my breath visible in the air as I stepped out of the car. This time, I was determined not to leave empty. I climbed down the embankment again, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I scanned the ground, the trees, the guardrail, anything that might hold a clue. But as I reached the bottom, I noticed something different. There were faint tire tracks in the dirt. I knelt down, tracing them with my fingers. They were fresh. My heart began to race. Someone else had been here, recently. I followed the tracks, my mind racing with possibilities. The path led deeper into the woods, away from the road. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed on, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I moved. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches casting strange shadows. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a glimpse of something metallic in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, the car from the crash. It was half hidden by the undergrowth, the hood crumpled, the windows shattered, but it was unmistakable. The same car I had seen go over the guardrail. I approached slowly, my hands shaking. The air felt colder here, heavier. I circled the car, expecting to find something, anything that would explain what had happened. But just like before, there was no one inside. No driver, no sign of life. I stood there, staring at the wreck, trying to process what I was seeing. The car was real, yet it felt wrong, out of place. My thoughts raced as I snapped a few pictures with my phone, desperate to capture proof this time. But as I moved closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The engine. It wasn't cold. It was still warm, as if the car had only just been driven here. That's when I heard the sound, a rustling in the bushes behind me. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, my flashlight darting over the trees, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven. I stood still, listening, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I wasn't alone out here. Someone, or something, was watching me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over me. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of there before it was too late. But I couldn't just walk away, not without answers. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the car again, hoping to find some clue, something that would explain what was going on. Just as I reached for the car door, I heard it again, closer this time. A soft crunch of leaves, like someone stepping carefully, deliberately. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to turn around, but I had no choice. Slowly, I raised the flashlight and swept it across the trees. And that's when I saw it. Movement. A figure, barely visible, darting between the trees. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. My survival instinct kicked in, and I bolted back up the hill, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear footsteps behind me now, growing closer. I ran faster, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. All I could think about was getting to my car, locking the doors, and driving away as fast as I could. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside and slammed the door, locking it immediately. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure chasing me. But the road behind me was empty. No movement, no shadows. I peeled out of there, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. As I sped away from the scene, I couldn't stop glancing in my rearview mirror. My breathing was uneven, heart still pounding. No matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The road seemed endless, stretching on into the dark. I kept my foot on the gas, desperate to put as much distance between me and that car as possible. My phone rang. The sound startled me so badly, I almost swerved off the road. I grabbed it from the seat beside me, hands trembling. It was a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." My voice was shaky. The other end was silent for a moment. Then, a low voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." My blood ran cold. I hung up immediately, throwing the phone onto the passenger seat. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the lights of the town came into view. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. I glanced at my phone again, afraid to pick it up. I didn't recognize the number, but the message was clear. Someone had been out there with me. Someone who knew I had seen the car. After a few minutes, I finally gathered the courage to pick up the phone again. I checked my call log. The number that had called me, it wasn't listed. It was as if the call had never happened. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. Nothing about this made sense. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. But deep down, I knew I was in over my head. I couldn't go home. Not yet. I needed answers. I took out the piece of metal I'd found by the wreck and studied it under the gas station lights. It wasn't much, but maybe it could lead me somewhere. I decided to take it to a mechanic I knew, someone who might be able to identify where it came from. I needed any clue, no matter how small, to figure out what was going on. The next morning, I went to see the mechanic, an old friend named Carl. I told him I'd found the metal on the side of the road, leaving out the details of the crash. He took one look at it and frowned. "This is old," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Maybe from a car made 20, 30 years ago." That didn't make sense. The car I saw was modern, new. I thanked him and left, more confused than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about what Carl had said. How could a piece of metal from an old car end up at the site of a crash involving a new one? Something wasn't adding up. I decided to drive back to Route 27 one last time during the day. Maybe in the light, things would look different. Maybe I'd find some explanation that had been hidden by the darkness the night before. When I arrived at the scene, the road looked the same as ever. Peaceful, even. But there was something unsettling about being there in broad daylight. It was as if the road itself was hiding its secrets beneath the surface. I parked and got out, determined to search every inch of the area. But just as I reached the guardrail, I froze. There was a police car parked up ahead. An officer was standing by the side of the road, staring at me. I hesitated, unsure whether I should approach or leave. But before I could decide, the officer started walking toward me. His expression was unreadable. "You're back," he said, more a statement than a question. My throat tightened. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm trying to figure out what happened here." The officer didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the spot where the car had gone off the road. "Maybe some things are better left alone," he finally said. The way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what to say. After a long silence, he turned and walked back to his car. I stood there, watching him drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. His words echoed in my mind. Maybe some things are better left alone, but I couldn't leave it alone. Not now. I had come too far to turn back. I spent the next few hours combing through the area, looking for anything I might have missed. But just like before, there was nothing. No skid marks, no broken glass. It was as if the crash had never happened. Frustration gnawed at me. I was running out of options. I sat down on the guardrail, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, a faint shape in the trees. It was barely visible through the leaves, but there was something out there. I stood up, my pulse quickening. I walked toward the shape, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A small, rusted sign, half buried in the undergrowth. The paint was peeling, but I could just make out the words. "Dangerous curve. Drive with caution." The sign looked ancient, like it hadn't been maintained in decades. I stared at the sign, my mind racing. The road had been dangerous for a long time. Accidents had happened here before, but none of them had left any trace. I turned and looked back at the road, trying to connect the dots. Something was wrong with this place. Something that made cars, drivers, entire crashes disappear. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. The air around me felt heavier, thicker. I didn't know what else to do, so I left. As I drove back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, the road behind me seemed darker than it should have been. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease stayed with me. Even when I got home, I couldn't relax. I locked all the doors and windows, feeling more paranoid than ever. That night, the nightmares returned, but this time, they were worse. In the dream, I was back on Route 27, standing by the guardrail, staring down at the wreck. But this time, the car wasn't empty. There was a figure inside, staring up at me. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes, cold and accusing. I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing. I didn't sleep again after that. I couldn't keep living like this. The fear, the paranoia, it was taking over my life. I decided to leave town for a while, to get away from Route 27 and everything that had happened. Maybe distance would help me forget. I packed up a few things and left early in the morning, driving aimlessly, trying to clear my head. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still wrong. A week passed, then another. Slowly, the nightmares started to fade, and the constant fear began to subside. I didn't go back to Route 27, didn't talk about what had happened. Life started to feel normal again. I even considered staying away from town for good, starting over somewhere else. But deep down, I knew I couldn't run forever. I had to face it eventually. The road wasn't done with me yet. One morning, as I was getting ready to leave my hotel, I found something strange in my bag. It was the small piece of metal from the wreck. I had forgotten all about it, but there it was, sitting at the bottom of my suitcase. I held it in my hand, staring at it for a long time. I stared at the piece of metal, turning it over in my hand. It was rusted and bent, but holding it brought back everything I had been trying to forget. I felt a strange pull, like the metal was drawing me back to Route 27. My heart sank. I knew what I had to do. As much as I didn't want to, I had to go back. I had to confront whatever was waiting for me on that road. The drive back to town was tense. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Every mile felt heavier than the last, as if the road was trying to keep me away. But I kept going, knowing I couldn't avoid it any longer. The closer I got to Route 27, the more I could feel that familiar sense of dread creeping over me. I wasn't just going back to the road, I was going back to something deeper. When I reached the curve on Route 27, the place where everything had started, the road looked the same, empty, quiet, almost peaceful. But I knew better now. I parked my car and stepped out, the cool air biting at my skin. The piece of metal felt heavy in my pocket. I approached the guardrail, the same spot where I had seen the car go over. I stood there, waiting, as if expecting something to happen. The silence was unnerving. I half expected the car to reappear in the same spot, crashing through the trees, but nothing happened. I took a deep breath and pulled the piece of metal out of my pocket. Holding it in my hand, I felt a strange sense of finality, like this was the last piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving. I tossed the metal over the guardrail, watching it disappear into the brush. I stood there for a long time, staring down the embankment. There was no car, no wreck, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. But something had changed. The weight in my chest lifted, ever so slightly, as if letting go of that piece of metal had released whatever had been holding me. I didn't have all the answers, but I felt like I had done what I came to do. It was time to leave. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. But the road was empty, just like it had always been. I got into my car and started the engine, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. This time, when I drove away, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I was finally free. The drive back home was quiet. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. No more looking over my shoulder, no more nightmares. Whatever had happened on that road was behind me now. I didn't need to understand it. I just needed to move on. The highway stretched out ahead of me, endless and open. I kept my eyes on the road, determined not to look back. Over the next few days, life slowly returned to normal. The nightmares stopped. The constant tension in my chest faded. I went back to work, saw friends, and even started driving at night again. It felt strange at first, but gradually, I reclaimed that part of my routine. The fear that had gripped me for so long was gone, replaced by a cautious sense of peace. I still think about Route 27 sometimes. Late at night, when the roads are empty and the world is quiet, my mind drifts back to that curve. I wonder if anyone else has seen what I saw, if anyone else has felt the strange pull of that place. But I never go back. I don't think I could, even if I wanted to. Some roads are meant to be left behind. One day, a few weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, no name, just my address, scrawled in messy handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. My heart nearly stopped when I saw what was on it. It was the car, the one from the crash, sitting in the same spot I had found it. The same broken windows, the same crumpled hood. I stared at the photograph, my hands trembling. There was no note, no explanation, just the car, sitting in the woods, like it was waiting for me. I didn't know who had sent it, or why, but I felt the same cold dread creeping back into my chest. Someone else had been there. Someone else had seen what I saw, and they knew I hadn't forgotten. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the photograph haunted me. I locked it away in a drawer, out of sight, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. That road, that car, would always be with me, lurking at the edges of my mind. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much time passed, it would never really let me go. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on, but I started noticing little things. My car keys would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, but no one would be there when I answered. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the signs were all there. The road wasn't done with me yet. I wasn't free. Not really. One night, as I lay in bed, My phone buzzed with a text. My stomach dropped when I saw the message. It was from an unknown number. 3 simple words. Come back now. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I knew I shouldn't. I knew I was playing with fire. But some part of me, some irrational, terrified part, needed to know, needed to understand what was happening. I didn't sleep that night. The message played on a loop in my mind. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed a small bag and got into my car. The road stretched out ahead of me, familiar and endless. My heart pounded as I headed back toward Route 27, back to the curve. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. The road was calling me back. When I reached the curve, the air felt colder, heavier. I parked my car in the same spot as before and stepped out, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. Everything looked the same, but I knew something was different this time. I approached the guardrail slowly, my heart racing in my chest. The piece of metal was long gone, but the feeling of dread was stronger than ever. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was only silence. Just when I was about to turn and leave, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. Look behind you. My blood turned to ice. I didn't want to turn around, but I had no choice. Slowly, I turned to face the road. There, in the distance, headlights flickered on. A car, the same one from the crash, sat in the middle of the road, engine idling. My heart pounded in my chest. This time, I didn't run. I stood frozen, watching as the car's engine revved, its lights brightening, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The road was empty again. But I knew, deep down, it would be back. The road never really lets go. Next story. I've always been the type of person who values routine. Weekdays were predictable. Work, dinner, a quick chat with my best friend, Lisa, and then bed. Lisa and I had been inseparable for years, ever since we met at a local coffee shop. We told each other everything, or at least, I thought we did. Recently, things had felt off. Lisa wasn't calling as often, and when she did, her responses were curt, distracted. I couldn't help but wonder if something had changed. It wasn't long before I found out Lisa had met someone. At first, I was thrilled for her. She deserved someone special. But when I asked to meet her mysterious partner, she deflected. They're really private, she'd say. It's still early. It wasn't like Lisa to be secretive. I pushed the feeling down, convincing myself she was just excited about this new relationship and wanted to keep it to herself for a while. But the weirdness didn't stop there. In fact, it only got worse. Weeks passed, and Lisa started distancing herself even more. Our regular hangouts became rare, and she barely returned my texts. When I asked her what was going on, she'd brush me off with vague excuses. Work's just been crazy. Or, I'm really focused on the relationship right now. There was something in her voice, though. It wasn't just stress or excitement. It was fear. The way she paused before answering, the nervous edge. It all made me uncomfortable. I decided to dig a little deeper. I asked around, curious if any of our mutual friends had met Lisa's new partner. None of them had. In fact, no one even knew she was seeing someone. That struck me as odd. Lisa had always been open about her life, especially with those close to her. One evening, I called her again, this time insisting that we meet. Come on, let's get dinner, I said, trying to sound casual. I miss you. She hesitated, but finally agreed. Something told me this dinner was going to be revealing. When we met up, Lisa looked exhausted. Her once vibrant energy was replaced with a kind of anxious detachment. We ordered our usual drinks, but the conversation felt strained. I tried to break the ice, but her eyes kept darting to the window, like she was expecting someone, or afraid of someone. Lisa, what's going on? I finally asked. Nothing, she muttered. Everything's fine, but I didn't believe her. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew it wasn't fine. Is it your partner? I pressed, trying not to sound too accusatory. Are they treating you well? Lisa's fingers tightened around her glass, her knuckles going white. For a second, I thought she might break down, but instead, she just shook her head. You wouldn't understand, she whispered. The response sent a chill down my spine. Lisa had never talked to me like that. Then help me understand, I said softly. She sighed, but before she could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at her phone screen and quickly silenced it, shoving it into her purse. I have to go, she said abruptly, standing up from the table. Wait, Lisa, we haven't even finished. I started, but she was already halfway to the door. I watched her walk away, my heart pounding with concern. Whoever was texting her had an unnerving amount of control over her. As she disappeared into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next day, I began looking for clues. I scrolled through her social media, but there was nothing new. No photos, no mentions of a partner, no evidence at all that she was even in a relationship. It was like her life had come to a standstill. I remembered Lisa had once mentioned the name of the company where her partner supposedly worked. So I did a quick search online. Nothing came up. That didn't make sense. It was a legitimate company, but there was no trace of this person. I called Lisa later that evening. My stomach was in knots as I dialed her number, half expecting her not to answer. When she picked up, her voice was flat, almost robotic. Hey, she said. What's up? I could hear the distance, the hesitation. Lisa, I need to know what's going on, I said, my voice firm but gentle. Who is this person you're seeing? Why won't you let anyone meet them? There was a long pause on the other end. Then, she sighed. You won't like the answer, she said quietly. Try me, I replied. I could hear her breathing, shaky and uncertain. I can't talk about it right now, she said. It's just complicated. She sounded scared. My heart raced as I realized just how deep this went. Lisa, I'm your friend. You can trust me. Whatever this is, I'll help you. Another long silence. Finally, she whispered, I don't think I can leave. The words sent a chill through me. What had she gotten herself into? I wanted to push further, but I didn't want to scare her off. Okay, I said carefully. We don't have to talk about it now, but when you're ready, I'm here. She murmured a thank you, and we hung up. I stared at my phone, feeling more unsettled than ever. Lisa was clearly in some kind of trouble, but I couldn't force her to open up. I'd have to wait for her to come to me. But waiting didn't sit well with me. I needed to know what was really going on. I decided to do some digging on my own. The next weekend, I drove to Lisa's apartment. I knew she wouldn't be home. She had mentioned she'd be out of town with her partner. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to see if I could find anything. Maybe a clue, something that would give me more insight into what was happening. I walked up to her door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. As expected, there was no answer. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching before trying the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I stepped inside, feeling like a criminal. Lisa's apartment was eerily quiet, and for a moment, I debated turning around and leaving. But something kept me there, a nagging feeling that I needed to understand. I walked through the living room, my eyes scanning for anything unusual. Then, something caught my attention. A notebook on the coffee table. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't resist. I opened it. The notebook was filled with frantic scribbles, barely legible, as if written in a hurry. Most of it didn't make sense. Random thoughts, lists, names I didn't recognize. But one sentence, repeated over and over, stood out. I can't leave. He won't let me. My heart sank. I had to get her out of this. But how? I couldn't confront her directly without scaring her further. I needed more information. and then I saw something else. Underneath the notebook was a piece of paper, folded and worn. It was a letter, written in Lisa's handwriting, but addressed to someone named Nate. I skimmed through it, my pulse quickening. She was pleading with him to stop following her, to leave her alone. My mind raced. Had she lied to me about being in a relationship? Was this Nate some kind of stalker? I stuffed the letter in my pocket, my head spinning. Whoever this person was, they weren't her partner. They were something far worse. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a car pulling up. Panic surged through me. I couldn't be caught here. I quickly put the notebook back on the table and glanced around, trying to figure out the best way to leave without being seen. My mind raced with possibilities. The window? No, too obvious. I hurried toward the back door, careful not to make a sound. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, praying whoever was outside hadn't noticed my presence. I slipped out quietly, my heart pounding. I crouched behind a bush in the backyard, waiting. I could hear the car door slam shut and footsteps approaching the front of the house. I couldn't see who it was, but my gut told me it was Nate. My pulse quickened as I heard a key jingling at the front door. I was trapped, but I had to stay calm. I peeked around the bush, trying to catch a glimpse of the person. A tall man with a baseball cap entered the house, his posture tense. This had to be him. As soon as the man went inside, I made my move. I crept along the side of the house, keeping low to the ground. Every footstep felt like it was amplified, echoing in the silence of the night. I reached the gate at the edge of the yard and carefully pushed it open. The rusty hinges squeaked, and I froze. For a split second, I thought the man inside might have heard me, but after a few agonizing seconds, there was no movement from the house. I bolted. I ran all the way to my car, parked a few blocks away, and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I was certain now that Lisa was in danger. Whoever Nate was, he was controlling her life, keeping her isolated. I needed to figure out how deep this went, and if Lisa had any way out. I drove home, my mind racing with possibilities. I couldn't involve the police yet, not without proof. When I got home, I locked every door and window, paranoid that Nate could somehow track me down. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter, her desperate words, her pleas to be left alone. What had he done to make her so afraid? I took out the letter and read it again, trying to find anything I might have missed. One line stuck out this time. Meet me where it all started. Where had it all started? I needed to talk to Lisa, but I couldn't just call her. I decided to try visiting Lisa's favorite spot, a small park near her old apartment. We used to hang out there all the time, and if there was anywhere she might feel safe, it was there. I grabbed the letter, stuffed it in my jacket, and headed out. The park was only a few minutes away, but every minute felt like an hour. I had no idea if she'd even show up, but I had to try. When I arrived, the place was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat on the bench where we used to meet. I waited for what felt like hours. The park was empty, except for the occasional jogger passing by. I was about to give up when I saw her, walking slowly, her head down. Relief washed over me as she approached, but the look on her face told me something was terribly wrong. "Lisa," I called softly. She barely glanced up, her eyes wide with fear. She sat down beside me, trembling. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Lisa, what's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "You're scaring me." She shook her head, biting her lip. "He knows everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "He knows where I am, who I'm with. I can't get away." Her eyes darted around the park, like she expected someone to jump out at any moment. "You need to tell me who this guy is," I urged. "We can figure something out, but I can't help you if you don't talk to me." She finally met my eyes, and I could see tears forming. "It's too late," she said, her voice cracking. He won't let me go. I reached out, placing my hand on hers. Lisa, we can fix this. Please, let me help. She glanced at my hand, then back at me. For a moment, I thought she was going to open up, but then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She jumped, her hand flying to silence it. I have to go, she said quickly, standing up. I'll talk to you later. I watched helplessly as she hurried away, leaving me alone on the bench. That was the moment I realized how serious this was. Lisa wasn't just in a bad relationship. She was trapped, manipulated by someone who was watching her every move. I couldn't let this go. I had to figure out who Nate was and how to help her, even if she didn't ask for it directly. I pulled out my phone and began searching for any information I could find about him. It wasn't easy, but after a lot of digging, I finally found something. A photo of him on a forum, linked to multiple complaints. The complaints all seemed to follow a pattern. Women mentioning how this man had infiltrated their lives, gotten close, and then slowly taken control. He manipulated them, isolated them from friends and family, and left them terrified to leave. My blood ran cold as I read the stories. Nate wasn't just some bad boyfriend. He was dangerous. I knew I had to confront him, but I also knew I couldn't go in unprepared. I needed a plan, and I needed to let Lisa know I was there for her. The next day, I sent Lisa a text. I kept it simple. I found out who Nate is. We need to talk. I wasn't sure if she would respond, but I had to try. Hours passed with no reply, and I began to worry that I had scared her off. Finally, just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed. It was from Lisa. Meet me tonight. Same place. My heart pounded as I read the message. I didn't know what to expect, but I had to be there. This was my chance to help her. That night, I returned to the park, the same bench where we had met before. This time, I was on edge, scanning the area for any sign of Nate. The last thing I needed was for him to show up and derail everything. Lisa arrived, looking more exhausted than ever. She sat down beside me without a word, her eyes fixed on the ground. I know who he is, I said quietly, and I know what he's done to other women. She winced, but didn't deny it. You need to leave him, I urged. I can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. He'll find me. He always finds me. I shook my head, leaning closer. Lisa, I've read the stories. He does this to every woman he gets involved with. You're not the first, but you can get out. She looked at me, her eyes filled with doubt. What if he comes after you, too? She asked. He won't, I lied, trying to sound confident. We'll figure this out together, but we need to act fast. She nodded, though fear still lingered in her expression. Here's what we'll do, I began, outlining the plan I had come up with. I had found a safe place for Lisa to stay. A friend of mine who lived in another city, far enough away that Nate wouldn't be able to track her easily. We'd pack her things tonight, quietly, and get her out before morning. Lisa listened, her hands trembling in her lap. You really think this will work? She asked, her voice shaky. I know it will, I reassured her, though a part of me was just as terrified as she was. We agreed to meet later that night, after she packed up what little she could carry. I would pick her up and take her to my friend's place, a safe haven where Nate couldn't find her. The hours until then dragged on. I couldn't sit still. My mind raced with all the ways this could go wrong, but I had to trust that we were doing the right thing. When the time finally came, I drove to her apartment, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The streets were quiet, but my heart wasn't. When I arrived, Lisa was already outside, standing by the curb with a small suitcase. She looked frail, her shoulders hunched and eyes darting nervously up and down the street. Let's go, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She got into the car quickly, glancing behind her as if she expected Nate to show up at any moment. I tried to reassure her, telling her that everything was going to be okay, but I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. The drive to my friend's place felt tense, every passing car making me flinch. I could feel Lisa's anxiety radiating off her, and I couldn't help but check the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see Nate's car tailing us. But the road remained empty, and after what felt like an eternity, we arrived. My friend was waiting for us, and she welcomed Lisa inside with open arms. For the first time in weeks, I saw Lisa relax, if only a little. As Lisa settled into the guest room, I stepped outside to call the police. It was time to report Nate, to make sure he couldn't follow her or continue to torment other women. I gave them everything I knew, including the stories I'd found online and the letter from Lisa. They promised to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Nate wouldn't go down without a fight. After I hung up, I stood outside for a moment, staring into the darkness. Over the next few days, Lisa stayed with my friend, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. She cut off contact with Nate completely, blocked his number, and deleted her social media accounts. It was a start, but I could see how much he had worn her down. She jumped at every noise, constantly looked over her shoulder, and barely slept. I tried to be there for her as much as I could, visiting every day and checking in. One afternoon, Lisa asked if we could go back to her apartment to grab the rest of her belongings. She didn't feel safe going alone, and I didn't blame her. I agreed, and we made plans to go during the day, when it would be less likely for Nate to be lurking around. When we arrived, everything seemed normal at first. We went inside and began packing her things, but as we moved through the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finished packing, I noticed something out of place, a small camera, hidden in the corner of her bedroom, facing the bed. I froze. "Lisa," I whispered, my voice tight. "Did you know about this?" She looked at the camera, her face going pale. "No," she whispered back, her hands trembling. We had no idea how long it had been there, or what Nate had seen, but it was clear that he had been spying on her. I grabbed the camera and stuffed it into my bag. We needed to get out of there fast. We hurried out of the apartment, my heart racing. I could feel Lisa's fear as we rushed down the stairs and out to the car. As soon as we were inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. "We need to take this to the police," I said, holding up the camera. I drove straight to the station, my mind buzzing with a million questions. Had Nate been watching her the whole time? What else had he done? We handed the camera over to the police and filed a report. The police assured us they would investigate, but I could see the doubt in Lisa's eyes. She had been through so much, and I wasn't sure if she believed anyone could really protect her. As we left the station, I put a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get through this," I said, trying to sound confident. "You're not alone." She gave me a weak smile, but I could tell she was still terrified. We drove back to my friend's house in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. Over the next few days, I kept a close eye on Lisa. She stayed at my friend's place, but she was still jumpy, as if expecting Nate to show up at any moment. The police were investigating, but progress was slow. Every time I visited her, I could see the toll it was taking on her. I hated seeing her like this, but I didn't know how to make it better. All I could do was be there for her and hope that the police would catch Nate before he could do any more damage. Then one night, everything changed. I was sitting at home when I got a call from Lisa. She was whispering, her voice barely audible. "He's here," she said, her voice shaking. "Nate's outside the house." My heart stopped. "Stay inside, lock the doors, and call the police," I told her, grabbing my keys. "I'm on my way." I jumped into my car and sped toward my friend's place, my mind racing. How had Nate found her? Had he been following us all along? I arrived in record time, my heart pounding as I pulled up to the house. The street was eerily quiet, and I couldn't see anyone outside. I jumped out of the car and ran to the front door, knocking frantically. Lisa let me in, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Did you see him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, scanning the windows. "But we need to stay inside until the police get here." We locked all the doors and huddled in the living room. Minutes felt like hours as we sat there in silence, every creak of the house making us jump. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a call from the police. Lisa was trembling beside me, her eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. "What if he gets in?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "He won't," I reassured her, though my own fear was creeping in. Just as I was about to call the police again, we heard a car pull up outside. The police searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of Nate. They assured us they would keep a close watch on the neighborhood and patrol more frequently. But it wasn't enough to put Lisa at ease. She was still terrified, and I couldn't blame her. After the officers left, we sat together in silence for a while, both of us trying to process what had just happened. "He's not going to stop," Lisa finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore." I didn't have an answer for her. Nate had already shown that he was relentless, and the thought of him lurking out there, waiting for his chance, made my skin crawl. "We'll figure something out," I said, trying to sound reassuring. There has to be a way to stop him, but deep down, I wasn't sure if we could. As much as I wanted to believe that the police could protect her, I knew that people like Nate didn't give up easily. He was obsessed, and that made him dangerous. That night, neither of us slept much. Lisa stayed curled up on the couch, her eyes half closed, but never fully at ease. I stayed awake, watching the windows, every little sound making my heart race. The weight of what was happening sank in deeper with each passing hour. Nate was out there, somewhere, and we had no idea what he was planning. The police had promised to patrol, but even that felt like a temporary solution. I wondered how long we could keep running from him. In the morning, I called the police again to follow up. They had no new information and no leads on Nate's whereabouts. It was frustrating. We were stuck, waiting for something to happen, and I could see how it was wearing Lisa down. Her once bright spirit seemed crushed under the constant weight of fear. "I can't live like this," she muttered, her voice small and distant. I wished I could offer her more than just words, but at the moment, words were all I had. Later that day, I called in a favor from a friend who worked in private security. I explained the situation, and they agreed to come by and assess Lisa's safety. Within a few hours, my friend had installed a more advanced security system, complete with cameras and motion sensors. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. Lisa seemed relieved, if only for a brief moment. "Thank you," she whispered as the installation was completed. As we sat down to dinner that evening, Lisa's phone buzzed on the table. We both froze. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart pounded in my chest as she showed me the message. "You can't hide forever." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the phone and immediately called the police, relaying the new threat. This time, they promised to take it more seriously. The next few days were tense, but quiet. Lisa stayed mostly inside, too afraid to venture out. I stayed by her side as much as I could, knowing that the weight of everything was getting heavier on her with each passing day. We had no idea when Nate would make his next move, but we knew it was coming. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the porch, Lisa turned to me. "Do you think I'll ever be free of him?" she asked softly. I didn't know what to tell her. That evening, as the sun set, Lisa and I talked about her options. I suggested moving far away, starting fresh in a new city where Nate couldn't find her. "But what if he follows me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if he tracks me down again?" I didn't have an easy answer. "We can't live in fear forever," I said. "There has to be a way out of this." She nodded slowly, but I could see that she was still scared. Nate had proven how dangerous and unpredictable he could be. The next morning, we woke to another chilling message from Nate. "I know where you are. It read. Lisa's hands shook as she showed it to me, her eyes wide with panic. I immediately called the police again, explaining the new development. They promised to send someone out to patrol the area more frequently, but I could sense that Lisa was losing hope. It was like every time we thought we were making progress, Nate found a way to remind us that he was still out there, lurking, waiting. I couldn't let him win. That night, I stayed up late, researching restraining orders and legal options. But the more I read, the more I realized how difficult it would be to fully stop someone like Nate. His threats were vague enough to avoid direct action, and the police, while helpful, seemed to be limited in what they could do. I felt helpless, but I wasn't ready to give up. I knew I had to stay strong for Lisa. We needed to keep pushing, keep looking for ways to protect her from him. The following day, I decided to confront Nate directly. It was risky, but I couldn't stand the thought of sitting around, waiting for him to make the next move. I found his address online through a public records search and drove there, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled up to his apartment building, I felt a wave of nausea. What was I doing? Was this really the right choice? But it was too late to turn back. I parked the car and headed toward the building, my hands shaking. When I reached his door, I hesitated for a moment, then knocked. There was no answer at first, but after a few seconds, I heard footsteps approaching. The door swung open, and there he was, Nate. He looked nothing like I'd imagined. He was calm, composed, and his expression was almost smug. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if he didn't already know who I was. "You need to leave Lisa alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She doesn't want anything to do with you anymore." "Oh, I'm not done with Lisa," he said, his voice low and chilling. "She owes me, and I always collect." My stomach turned at his words. "Stay away from her," I repeated, feeling the anger rise in my chest. "Or I'll make sure you regret it." Nate laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, "but you'll find out soon enough." I clenched my fists, but I knew there was nothing more I could do in that moment. As I got back into my car, I felt a sinking dread settle over me. Nate wasn't going to back down. In fact, I was more certain than ever that he would escalate. I drove back to Lisa's, trying to come up with a new plan. The confrontation hadn't gone the way I'd hoped, but at least I had looked him in the eye. I'd made it clear that we wouldn't just sit back and let him torment her. But how long could we keep this up? How long before Nate took things too far? When I told Lisa about the confrontation, she was understandably upset. "What if he comes after you now?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I didn't know what Nate was capable of. "We just need to stay vigilant," I said. "We're stronger than he thinks." Lisa nodded, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. It was hard not to feel powerless in a situation like this, but I couldn't let Nate see that. We had to be strong, even if it felt impossible. That night, we heard something outside. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable. Lisa's eyes widened in terror. "He's here," she whispered. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my heart racing. We huddled in the back room, listening as the footsteps grew louder. I could hear Lisa's ragged breathing beside me. We waited, every second, dragging on painfully. The police arrived within minutes, and I heard the sirens outside. The footsteps stopped. When the officers searched the yard, they found no one. The police reassured us that they would increase patrols around the area, but it was clear that Nate was still lurking, watching. I didn't know how much longer we could endure this. Lisa was unraveling, and I was starting to feel the strain myself. We couldn't live like this forever. Something had to give. The next morning, I sat down with Lisa, and we talked about getting her out of the country. It seemed drastic, but at this point, it felt like our only option. We began researching how she could relocate somewhere far away, somewhere Nate wouldn't be able to follow. It wasn't going to be easy. There were so many details to consider. but Lisa was determined. I saw a spark of hope in her for the first time in weeks. She wanted to start over, rebuild her life somewhere Nate couldn't touch her. As we sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through options, I felt a glimmer of optimism. Maybe this was how we could finally break free from him. The process took a few days to put together. We worked quickly, setting up her new life, making sure all the details were covered. We found a small town where she could disappear for a while, far from anyone who knew her, or Nate. She was nervous, understandably so, but I could see that she was ready to take this leap. "I can't believe it's really happening," she said one night, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "You're going to be safe," I reassured her. The plan was set. Lisa would leave in 2 days, early in the morning. I would drive her to the airport, and she would board a flight to a place where Nate could never reach her. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but it was the only option we had left. The night before she was supposed to leave, we double-checked everything: tickets, documents, contacts. I stayed the night, not wanting to leave her alone in case Nate tried something. Morning came, and the tension was unbearable. We packed up her things, trying to stay focused. Lisa barely spoke, her mind clearly racing. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. As we drove to the airport, neither of us said much, but there was a shared understanding that this was the last time we would be in this city together. The closer we got, the more nervous she became. "What if he's watching?" she whispered. "We're being careful," I assured her. At the airport, we checked in quickly, avoiding as much attention as possible. I stayed with her until the last possible moment, watching as she disappeared through security. "Call me when you land," I said, my voice tight with emotion. Lisa nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Then she was gone, lost in the crowd of travelers. I stood there for a while, watching the planes take off, wondering if this was really the end of it. I drove home in silence, my mind replaying everything that had happened over the last few weeks. It felt like a bad dream, one that I hoped we had finally escaped from. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa. "I'm boarding now. Thank you again. I'll miss you." I smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. But even as I tried to settle back into my own routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days were quiet. I kept expecting to hear from the police, hoping for news about Nate, but there was nothing. I checked in with Lisa, who was adjusting to her new life, though it was clear she was still on edge. "It's strange being in a new place," she said during one call, "but it feels good too, like I can finally breathe again." I was happy for her, but the silence around Nate's whereabouts kept gnawing at me. He had vanished, but it didn't feel like he was gone for good. Then one night, I received a call from an unknown number. My heart raced as I answered, half expecting it to be Nate, but it wasn't. It was the police. "We've found him," the officer said. "Nate was picked up a few towns over, caught trespassing on private property. He's in custody now." Relief washed over me like a flood. He had been caught. "Thank you," I muttered, barely able to process it. "Is Lisa safe?" "We'll make sure she's aware," the officer replied. It was over. I called Lisa right after the police hung up. "They caught him," I said, my voice trembling with relief. There was a long pause on the other end. "They got him," she whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. "He's in custody," I confirmed. "You're safe now." For the first time in weeks, I heard her let out a deep breath, almost like she had been holding it in the entire time. "I can't believe it," she said softly. "It's really over." In the days that followed, Lisa began to settle into her new life without fear hanging over her. She called me more often, her voice lighter, her words filled with hope. "I never thought I'd feel free again," she said one night, "but now I finally do." I listened, grateful that she was starting to heal. I, too, found myself relaxing, slowly letting go of the constant tension that had consumed us both. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Lisa in the mail. It was a simple note, thanking me again for standing by her during everything. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she wrote. "You saved me." I smiled as I read the words, feeling a sense of pride and relief that we had made it through together. It had been a long, terrifying journey, but Lisa was finally free, and so was I. We had faced down a nightmare, and somehow, we had come out on the other side. In the months that followed, Lisa continued to build her new life, slowly reclaiming her sense of safety and independence. We kept in touch regularly, and each time we spoke, I could hear the strength returning to her voice. It wasn't easy, but she was making progress, one day at a time. As for me, I finally felt like I could breathe again, too. The shadows that had once loomed over us had lifted, and we were both starting to live again. Though we were both healing, the experience had left its mark on us. There were still moments of anxiety, times when I would glance over my shoulder or check the locks more often than necessary. But with each passing day, those moments became fewer and farther between. I knew we had done the right thing by confronting Nate and protecting Lisa. She had found her way out, and that was all that mattered. Life was slowly returning to normal, or at least a new version of it. Every now and then, I would think back to the time when Nate had cast such a long shadow over our lives. It was strange how someone like him could have so much power, how he had manipulated and controlled Lisa's every move. But now, he was gone, locked away, and we were free. Lisa had rebuilt her life, and I was proud of her for finding the strength to move forward. I had been part of that journey, and it felt good to know that we had overcome it together. As the months turned into years, Lisa and I remained close. We didn't talk about Nate much anymore. There was no need to. He was part of the past, and the future was what mattered now. Lisa was happy, truly happy, and that was all I had ever wanted for her. Looking back, I knew we had made the right choices, even when things had seemed hopeless. We had survived, and that was enough. Next story. I've worked in factories for most of my life. The long hours, the hum of machines, and the smell of oil are as familiar to me as my own home. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. You'd think, after all these years, nothing would surprise me anymore. But the factory I transferred to 3 months ago was different. There was something off about the place, something unsettling. It wasn't just the outdated equipment or the eerie silence. It was the people, or rather, the lack of them. At first I didn't notice. The place was always understaffed, which wasn't unusual in a small town like ours. But one day, I realized something odd. A few of the workers who'd been there when I started were gone. I hadn't seen them in days. No one mentioned them, not even during breaks. Normally, you'd hear chatter about someone quitting or moving on to another job, but it was like they had just vanished. I asked around, but people either shrugged it off or acted like I was bothering them. It wasn't until my shift lead, Sam, disappeared that I really started to worry. Sam was the kind of guy who never missed a day of work. He had been at the factory for years, knew every machine inside and out. One day he just didn't show up. No call, no explanation. His workstation was empty, like he had never been there. I asked the supervisor about him, but all I got was a cold. "He's gone. Mind your own business." That's when the rumors started to circulate among the rest of us. One of the older guys, Fred, told me in a low voice during break that this wasn't the first time workers had disappeared without a word. "It's been happening for years," he said, glancing around like someone might be listening. "But no one talks about it. It's like the place swallows them whole." I didn't believe him at first. It sounded too strange. But then, a week later, another worker went missing. This time, it was a woman named Lily. No one said a word. They just went on with their day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I started looking for answers. asking questions, but it felt like I was hitting a wall everywhere I turned. A lot of people told me to drop it. Even outside the factory, it was like a silent rule not to bring it up. It wasn't until Lily's family showed up one afternoon, frantic and demanding answers, that I realized how deep this went. They were shouting, begging for someone to explain why their daughter hadn't come home. The supervisor, a man named Thompson, coldly dismissed them, saying she had probably just run off. But I could see it in their faces. They didn't believe him. Neither did I. After they left, I overheard a few of the workers whispering in the break room. "They'll get the message soon enough," one of them said, just like the others. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I had a bad feeling it wasn't good. I decided to keep my head down for a while, but the fear had already taken root. A few days later, I got a message from Fred. He wanted to meet outside of work, said he had something to show me. We met at a bar just outside town, and he looked worse than I had ever seen him. "They've been sending messages to the families," he said, his voice shaking. "Coded ones, like puzzles." I frowned. "What do you mean? What kind of messages?" Fred slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a piece of paper with a string of numbers and letters, nothing that made any sense to me. "This is what Lily's family got in the mail," Fred said. "They thought it was some sick joke at first, but then more of them started getting the same thing. Sam's family, the others who disappeared." I stared at the paper, my mind racing. Why would anyone send coded messages to the families of the missing workers? "What do they mean?" I asked. Fred shook his head. "No one knows. But people are scared. They think it's some kind of warning, a way to keep everyone quiet." That made me feel sick. I took the paper home that night, determined to figure out what the code meant. I'm not a genius, but I've always been good with numbers. It took hours, but I finally started to see a pattern. The numbers weren't random. They corresponded to coordinates, specific locations around town. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Were these locations connected to the missing workers? There was only one way to find out. I decided I'd check them out myself, even though the thought terrified me. The next day, I followed the first set of coordinates. It led me to an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't seen used in years. I parked my car and just sat there for a while, staring at the building. The windows were boarded up, and there was an eerie stillness to the place. I knew going inside was probably a bad idea, but I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and made my way to the entrance. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air inside the warehouse was stale, thick with dust. My footsteps echoed off the concrete floor as I walked through the empty space. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the place felt wrong, like something terrible had happened here. I shined the flashlight around, my heart racing. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, hidden behind some crates, was a small pile of personal belongings, a jacket, a pair of boots, a lunchbox, items that had clearly been left behind in a hurry. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was looking at. These were the belongings of the missing workers. I recognized Sam's jacket immediately. I moved closer, my hands shaking. There was no sign of the people themselves, just their things, abandoned like they had never meant to return. I stood there in the darkness, trying to make sense of it. What had happened to them? Why had they disappeared without a trace? And why was no one talking about it? I took a step back, feeling a sudden urge to leave. Whatever had happened here, I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I turned to go, something caught my eye. There was a door in the back, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Without thinking, I walked over and tried the handle. It was locked. Of course it was. But something about that door gnawed at me. I needed to know what was behind it. I made a note of the location and left quickly. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the warehouse, about the door and the belongings left behind. I needed to go back, but I couldn't do it alone. The next day at work, I found Fred and told him what I had discovered. His face went pale. "We can't go back there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's going on, it's dangerous. People have died for less." But I couldn't let it go. I convinced him to come with me, told him we'd be careful, just in and out. That night, we returned to the warehouse. Fred was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder, like we were being watched. I couldn't blame him. The place had an oppressive, haunted feeling, like it was hiding secrets just beneath the surface. We made our way to the door in the back. Fred tried the handle again, but it was still locked. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. I pulled out a crowbar I had brought along and started prying at the door. After a few minutes of effort, the lock gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air was colder down there, damp and heavy. Fred hesitated, but I pressed forward, shining the flashlight ahead of us. The stairs seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper beneath the warehouse. I could feel Fred's tension behind me, his breath quickening. "We should turn back," he whispered, but I ignored him. I had come too far. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended at a metal door. It looked old, rusted at the edges, but there was something fresh about the lock. Someone had been here recently. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Fred grabbed my arm. "You don't have to do this." I swallowed hard. "Yes, I do." I pushed the door open, and the sight before me made my blood run cold. It was a large room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Along the walls were rows of metal beds, like something you'd see in an old hospital. But what caught my attention were the people. They were lying on the beds, motionless, their faces pale. I recognized some of them immediately: Lily, Sam, and the others who had disappeared. They weren't dead, but they were trapped in some kind of deep sleep. Fred gasped behind me. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I stepped closer to one of the beds, my hands shaking. Sam's chest was rising and falling slowly, as if he were in some kind of induced coma. There were tubes connected to their arms, leading to machines I didn't understand. "We have to get out of here," Fred said, panic rising in his voice. I couldn't move. I was frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I moved toward the machines, my mind racing. Whoever had set this up knew what they were doing. This wasn't some random kidnapping. It was something more sinister, more calculated. I looked at Sam's face, pale and lifeless. "Why are they doing this?" I whispered, but no one had an answer. "We need to go. Now," Fred murmured. I nodded, backing away from the beds, my heart pounding. As we turned to leave, I noticed something in the corner, a camera, its red light blinking. Someone was watching. "Shit," I muttered, pointing at the camera. Fred's eyes widened. "They know we're here," he said. Panic surged through me. We ran for the stairs, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the narrow stairwell. Who was behind this? What were they doing to these people? We reached the warehouse floor, and I slammed the door behind us. "We need to tell someone," Fred gasped. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Whoever was doing this had power, and they wouldn't let us walk away easily. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying what we had seen over and over again. The missing workers, hooked up to machines, their lives suspended in some twisted experiment. My phone buzzed. It was Fred. "We need to lay low," he said, his voice shaky. "They know we've seen too much." He was right. If they were willing to do that to the workers, what would they do to us? I didn't respond. Instead, I stared at the piece of paper with the coordinates, wondering how deep this went. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow felt like someone watching. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't just walk away from this. no matter how dangerous it was. There were families out there, desperate for answers, and we had found something that could expose the truth. I called Fred. "We need to do something," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear bubbling inside me. He was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Meet me at the diner, in an hour." We met at a diner just outside of town, both of us looking over our shoulders, nervous that someone might be watching. "We can't go to the cops," Fred said, sipping his coffee. "They're probably in on it. You know how things work around here." The factory had connections all over town. I had no doubt that whatever was going on in that basement had some powerful people behind it. "So what do we do?" I asked. Fred looked around, then leaned in closer. "We need to blow the lid off this." Fred slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the coded messages the families had received, along with photos of the warehouse and the basement. "I've been gathering evidence for weeks," he said. "I didn't know what to do with it until now. But after what we saw last night, I think it's time we go public." My stomach twisted. Going public meant putting ourselves in the crosshairs of whoever was running this operation. "Are you sure?" I asked. Fred nodded. "It's the only way." We spent the rest of the day planning. Fred had a contact at a local newspaper, someone who had been digging into corruption at the factory for years. "She's been trying to get something concrete for ages," Fred explained. "This might be what she needs." I wasn't sure if going to the press was the right move, but we didn't have many options. By evening, we had gathered everything we could: photos, documents, the coordinates. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I glanced out the window, I expected to see a figure lurking in the shadows. Fred called me around midnight. "I dropped everything off with my contact," he said. "She's going to publish it tomorrow." It was really happening. "What if they come after us?" I asked. Fred's voice was tense. "We've already seen too much. They'll come after us either way. At least this way, the truth will be out." The next morning, the article went live. It detailed everything we had uncovered: the missing workers, the coded messages, the warehouse, and the basement filled with comatose people. The story spread quickly, shared across social media, and picked up by other outlets. But I wasn't relieved. I knew this was only the beginning. As I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the screen, my phone buzzed. It was Fred. "They know," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're coming for us." I barely had time to process Fred's words before there was a knock on my door. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, I walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. A man in a suit stood on my porch, his face unreadable. "Mr. Jenkins," he called out, his voice calm. "We need to talk." My hand shook as I backed away from the door. Whoever he wasn't here to chat. I grabbed my phone and texted Fred. "Someone's here. Get out. I heard the man try the doorknob, but luckily it was locked. "Mr. Jenkins, please," he called out again. "You're making this more difficult than it has to be." My pulse raced. One had to get out of there. I quietly moved toward the back door, hoping I could slip away before he found another way in. Just as I reached the kitchen, I heard the front door burst open. My stomach dropped. They were inside. I bolted out the back door, running as fast as I could toward my car. I didn't look back. I sped out of the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay at home. Fred texted back, "Meet me at the old gas station, west of town." I headed there, my mind racing. Whoever was after us wasn't messing around. They had already broken into my house, and it wouldn't be long before they found Fred. I just hoped I could get to him before they did. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark. The drive felt like it took forever, every minute stretching out in my mind. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But the road was empty, nothing but the dark outline of trees rushing by. When I finally reached the old gas station, Fred was already there, leaning against his car. His face was pale, and he looked shaken. "They're serious," he said, as I got out of the car. "I packed a few things," Fred said, tossing a duffel bag into the back seat of his car. "We can't go home. They've probably already tapped our phones. We need to go somewhere they won't find us." His words sent a chill through me. How had things escalated so quickly? Just a week ago, we were working regular shifts at the factory. I glanced around the empty gas station, realizing this might be the last time I saw my hometown. We drove through the night, heading toward the mountains. Fred didn't tell me where we were going, but it didn't matter. I trusted him. He had been thinking ahead, planning for this moment. "I know a place," he said after an hour of silence. "It's remote, off the grid. They won't find us there." I nodded, staring out the window at the endless stretch of road. My thoughts kept drifting back to the workers, lying in those beds, hooked up to machines. As dawn broke, we arrived at a small cabin deep in the woods. It was hidden off a dirt road, surrounded by thick trees. Fred parked the car and got out, stretching his legs. "No one knows about this place," he said, his voice tired but relieved. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the fresh air. The isolation was comforting, but it didn't erase the fear gnawing at me. Whoever was after us had resources, and I wasn't sure we could outrun them forever. Inside the cabin, it was small and basic. Just a couple of beds, a table, and a stove. Fred unpacked what little we had, while I sat at the table, staring out the window. "What's the plan?" I asked. Fred paused, running a hand through his hair. "We lay low for a while, see if the heat dies down. If it doesn't, we'll figure something out." His uncertainty made me nervous, but I didn't have a better idea. I knew that as long as the truth was out there, we were targets. Days passed, and the silence in the cabin was suffocating. We didn't have much to do, except wait, listen to the radio, and watch for any signs of movement in the woods. Fred was restless, pacing back and forth, his anxiety building. "What if they find us?" he asked one night, as we sat by the stove, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. I didn't have an answer. "We were out of options. We can't run forever," I replied. Fred nodded, his face grim. We both knew this couldn't last. One morning, Fred went into town to get supplies. I stayed behind, keeping an eye on the cabin, my nerves on edge. It was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Hours passed, and Fred still hadn't returned. My mind raced with possibilities. Had they found him? Was he being followed? I stood by the window, staring out at the empty road, hoping to see his car, but as the sun began to set, I started to panic. Something had happened, and I didn't know what to do. As darkness fell, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, pacing the yard. The woods felt oppressive, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a text from Fred. Asterisk, "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone." Asterisk, my stomach twisted with fear. I texted back. Asterisk, "What's going on?" There was no response. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. I went back inside and locked the door, every instinct telling me to hide. The hours dragged on, and still no sign of Fred. I sat by the window, watching the road, waiting for his car to appear, but it never did. Just as I was about to give up hope, I heard footsteps outside. My heart raced as I peeked through the curtains. A figure was standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness. My first thought was that it was Fred, but something felt off. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. The figure stayed there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, watching the cabin. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a knife from the kitchen, and stood by the door, every muscle in my body tense. My phone buzzed again. It was Fred. Asterisk, don't go outside. They're watching. Asterisk, my breath caught in my throat. Who was outside? I peered through the window again, but the figure was gone. The silence was deafening, and I felt trapped. Whoever was out there, they knew where we were. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, every creak of the cabin. The next morning, Fred still hadn't returned, and my anxiety had reached its peak. I needed to know what was happening. I grabbed my phone and tried calling him, but there was no answer. The isolation of the cabin, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a prison. I couldn't stay here forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Fred was in serious trouble. Just as I was about to make a run for it, I heard a car approaching. I rushed to the window and saw Fred's car pulling up the dirt road. Relief flooded through me, but it quickly turned to fear when I saw his face. He looked shaken, pale, like he had seen something terrible. I ran outside to meet him. What happened? I asked. Fred got out of the car, his hands trembling. They're closing in, he whispered. We have to leave. Now. We grabbed what little we had and threw it into the car, moving as quickly as we could. Fred was frantic, constantly looking over his shoulder like we were being followed. What did you see? I asked, as we sped down the dirt road. Fred's grip on the steering wheel tightened. I went into town, and there were men watching me. They followed me for a while, but I lost them. We can't stay here anymore. His words sent a chill through me. The danger was real, and it was getting closer. We drove 4 hours, heading further into the mountains, hoping to put as much distance between us and them as possible. Fred didn't say much, his eyes glued to the road, his face tense. I kept glancing behind us, expecting to see headlights, but there was nothing. The sun was setting, and the mountains loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Where are we going? I finally asked. Fred sighed. There's a safe house. An old friend of mine owns it. We'll be off the radar there, at least for a while. We arrived at the safe house just after nightfall. It was a small, unassuming cabin nestled deep in the woods, even more isolated than the last place. Fred parked the car, and we quickly unloaded our things, moving with the urgency of people who knew they were being hunted. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even out here. We're safe here, Fred said, trying to reassure me. Inside the safe house, the tension was palpable. Fred was on edge, pacing back and forth, while I sat by the window, keeping an eye on the woods. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing minute. What if they find us? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Fred stopped pacing and looked at me, his face grim. They won't. Not here. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. Neither of us believed it. We had been running for too long, and sooner or later, they would catch up. The hours dragged on, and night fell over the cabin like a heavy blanket. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Fred and I tried to stay busy, cleaning up the cabin and checking the perimeter. But no matter what we did, the sense of impending danger wouldn't leave. I kept looking out into the woods, expecting to see shadows moving between the trees. We can't keep running forever, I said, breaking the silence. Fred didn't answer. He didn't have to. We both knew it was true. Later that night, as we sat in the dim light of the cabin, we heard a noise outside. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock of fear through both of us. Fred stood up immediately, grabbing the flashlight. "Stay here," he said quietly, his voice tense. I wanted to protest, to tell him not to go outside, but the words stuck in my throat. He opened the door slowly, stepping out into the night. I stood by the window, watching his flashlight bob in the darkness. Fred disappeared into the trees, and the cabin felt unbearably quiet. Every second felt like an hour, as I stood there, waiting for him to return. The minutes ticked by, and the silence grew heavier. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a second flashlight, I stepped outside, calling Fred's name softly. There was no answer. The cold night air bit at my skin as I walked toward the trees, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Fred," I called again, my voice shaky. Still nothing. I moved deeper into the woods, every sound making my heart race. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the light of my flashlight. I felt completely alone, vulnerable. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something. A faint glimmer of light ahead, like Fred's flashlight reflecting off something metallic. I hurried toward it, my mind racing with possibilities. As I approached, I realized what it was. A metal hatch, partially covered by leaves and dirt. The hatch was old and rusted, but it was clear someone had used it recently. My hand shook as I crouched down, examining it. There were no markings, no signs of where it led. I called Fred's name again, but the forest remained silent. I had no idea what to do. Should I open it? Should I wait for Fred? My instincts told me this was connected to everything. The disappearances, the coded messages, the men who were after us. But going down there alone terrified me. After a long hesitation, I made my decision. I grabbed the handle of the hatch and pulled. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark tunnel beneath. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of earth filled my lungs. I shined the flashlight down, but the tunnel stretched too far for the light to reach the end. I lowered myself onto the metal rungs of the ladder, descending slowly into the darkness. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was leaving the world above behind. The tunnel was narrow, the walls damp and cold to the touch. My footsteps echoed as I walked, the sound bouncing off the tight space. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was down there with me. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and my breath caught in my throat. I stopped, listening for any sign of movement. The only sound was the distant drip of water. I pressed on, determined to find out what was at the end of this tunnel. The tunnel opened into a larger room. It was dimly lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. In the center of the room was a table, and on it was a collection of files and old documents. They were records, detailing the workers who had disappeared, their names, dates, and locations. My stomach twisted as I read through them. This wasn't just an accident. It was a carefully planned operation. As I flipped through the files, I found something even more disturbing. Coded messages, just like the ones the families had received. But these were different. They weren't addressed to the families. They were instructions. Orders to move workers, to cover up their disappearances. This was bigger than I had imagined. Whoever was behind this had been planning it for years, orchestrating the disappearances to keep something hidden. But what? I scanned the room, feeling more vulnerable than ever. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. A figure stood at the entrance to the room, barely visible in the dim light. My heart leaped into my throat. "Fred," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This couldn't be Fred. Something was wrong. The figure stepped forward, and in the flickering light, I saw their face. It wasn't Fred. It was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. Panic surged through me, and I backed up against the wall, the cold concrete pressing into my back. The strangers stepped closer, their face unreadable in the dim light. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they raised their hand, and in it, I saw something glinting in the light. A knife. "Please," I whispered, not sure what I was begging for. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I knew I was in serious danger. Before the figure could take another step, there was a shout from the tunnel behind them. "Get away from her!" It was Fred. Relief washed over me. But it was quickly followed by fear as the stranger turned toward the tunnel, their grip on the knife tightening. Fred charged at them, tackling the figure to the ground. The knife clattered to the floor, and I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking. The struggle continued, Fred wrestling with the stranger as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Fred managed to pin the stranger down, his face flushed with anger and fear. "Go," he shouted at me. "Get out of here." But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I watched as Fred wrestled with the stranger, the two of them locked in a desperate struggle. Finally, Fred managed to overpower them, knocking them unconscious. He stood up, breathing heavily, and looked at me. "We have to go. Now." His voice was sharp, urgent. We grabbed the files from the table and ran. We scrambled up the ladder and out of the hatch, the cool night air hitting me like a wave of relief. My heart was still pounding as we ran through the woods, branches whipping against my face. Fred was ahead of me, moving quickly, his breathing ragged. We got back to the car and sped down the dirt road, the files clutched in my lap. My mind was racing. What had we uncovered? Who were these people, and why did they go to such lengths to keep these workers hidden? Fred was tense, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "We need to get these files to someone who can help," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. I nodded, staring down at the papers in my lap. There were names, dates, and locations enough to expose whatever this operation was. But the question still lingered in my mind. Why? Why were they doing this? And what were they trying to hide? As we drove, Fred made a sudden turn off the main road and onto a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the forest. "Where are we going?" I asked, my anxiety growing with each passing minute. "There's a journalist I know," Fred said. "She's been looking into this for a while. If we can get these files to her, we might have a chance to blow this wide open." The plan sounded dangerous, but it was the only one we had. We reached the journalist's cabin late at night. It was small and isolated, nestled deep in the woods. Fred knocked on the door, and after a tense moment, a woman in her 40s answered. She had sharp eyes and looked like someone who had seen her fair share of trouble. "Fred," she said, surprised. "What the hell are you doing here?" Fred quickly explained everything. Her expression grew serious as she listened, and she motioned for us to come inside. Inside the cabin, Sarah, the journalist, sat us down at the table and looked through the files. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, taking in the details. "This is huge," she muttered. "Bigger than I thought." She looked up at Fred, her face serious. "If what's in these files is true, we're talking about a cover-up that goes all the way to the top. Powerful people are involved in this." I felt a chill run down my spine. The deeper we went, the more dangerous this became. "We need to move fast," Sarah said, standing up and pacing the room. "Once this gets out, they'll do everything they can to stop it. We need to get this story published before they catch wind of what we're doing." Fred nodded in agreement, but I couldn't shake the fear that we were running out of time. Whoever was behind this wouldn't let us walk away easily. Sarah grabbed her laptop and began typing furiously, uploading the files and preparing the story. Hours passed as Sarah worked, and I found myself staring out the window, watching the shadows shift in the moonlight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That any moment, someone would come crashing through the door to stop us. Fred sat across from me, equally tense. "Do you think this will work?" I asked quietly. Fred glanced at me, his eyes tired but determined. "It has to," he replied. "It's the only way to stop them." I nodded, but the fear still gnawed at me. Finally, Sarah finished her work and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. "It's done," she said. "The files are uploaded, and the story is set to go live in a few hours." I felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that the hardest part was still ahead. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Sarah gave me a grim look. "Now we wait, and hope we've bought ourselves enough time before they realize what's happening." We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we sat in the cabin, waiting. Every sound outside made me jump. Every rustle of the trees sent a shiver down my spine. Fred was silent, his eyes focused on the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Sarah kept checking her laptop, watching the stories spread online. "It's getting traction," she said, her voice low. "People are starting to notice." I should have felt relieved, but all I could think about was how close we were to being found. Just before dawn, we heard it. A car pulling up outside. My heart stopped. Fred stood up, motioning for me to stay back. Sarah grabbed her laptop and moved to the far side of the room. We were out of options. The car door slammed, and footsteps approached the cabin. I felt frozen in place, my body tense with fear. Fred moved toward the door, but before he could open it, there was a knock. The sound was slow, deliberate, sending chills down my spine. "Who is it?" Fred called out, his voice tight. There was no response. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Fred motioned for me to stay where I was, and he slowly opened the door. A man stood outside, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice calm but with an underlying threat. Fred stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "This is bad," she whispered. I didn't need her to tell me that. The conversation outside lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, Fred came back inside, his face pale. "We have to go," he said urgently. "Now?" Sarah grabbed her laptop, and we hurried out to the car. Fred didn't say much as we drove away from the cabin, but his silence spoke volumes. Whatever the man had said to him, it was clear that we weren't safe. "What did he say?" I asked quietly. Fred's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "He knows everything," he muttered. We drove 4 hours, putting as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. Fred's words echoed in my mind. He knows everything. Whoever this man was, he was connected to the people behind the disappearances, the coded messages, the experiments, and now he knew we were onto them. Sarah was typing furiously on her laptop in the back seat, sending updates to her contacts. "We need to keep this story alive," she said. "It's the only way we have a chance." We stopped at a small diner in the middle of nowhere, needing a break from the tension that had been building since we left the cabin. As we sat at a corner booth, Fred was still on edge, his eyes darting to every person who walked in. "What do we do now?" I asked, feeling lost. Fred sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We keep moving. We can't stop until we know for sure that the story has spread far enough. Once the truth is out, they won't be able to cover it up." The tension in the diner was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of this situation pressing down on me. We were in too deep now. There was no going back. As we finished our food, I noticed a car pull into the parking lot. It was the same one from the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. "They found us," I whispered. Fred glanced out the window, his face going pale. "We need to go," he said, grabbing his coat. We hurried out the back door of the diner, slipping into the woods behind it. We ran through the woods, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. My breath came in short gasps as I struggled to keep up with Fred. Behind us, I could hear the sound of voices, men calling out to each other, searching for us. "We need to split up," Fred said, stopping for a moment. "You go with Sarah. I'll lead them away." I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. "I'm not leaving you." But Fred was already moving, his eyes determined. "Go. It's the only way." I hesitated for a moment, but I knew Fred was right. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me along as we ran deeper into the woods. I glanced back one last time, watching as Fred disappeared into the trees. his footsteps fading into the distance. My heart ached, fear and guilt twisting inside me. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. Sarah and I kept moving, running until our legs felt like they would give out. The voices behind us grew fainter, but I knew they wouldn't stop. We found a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. Sarah collapsed onto the ground, her face pale and exhausted. "What now?" I asked, my voice shaking. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow, her breathing ragged. "We wait. Fred will find us when he can, but until then, we stay hidden." The fear in her voice matched my own. We were in survival mode now. Nothing else mattered but staying out of sight. I sat down beside her, trying to calm my racing heart, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. The hours passed slowly, the woods around us growing darker as the sun began to set. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle in the leaves felt like someone approaching. "Do you think Fred is okay?" I asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer right away. She stared at the ground, her expression unreadable. "He's smart," she finally said. "He'll find a way." But there was doubt in her voice, and it terrified me. We were on our own now, and for the first time, I realized just how far we'd gone.